The year is 1956. Across the golden sands of Egypt, the winds carry the echoes of empires long past. Britain and France, once masters of half the world, now watch their power slip quietly into history, and in their place, a new voice rises. Gamal Abdel Nasser, bold, young, and unyielding, dares to defy them. With one declaration, he seizes the Suez Canal and shakes the foundations of global power. What follows is not just a war over water, but a struggle for pride, freedom, and the future itself. In the calm before the storm, alliances form in secret, armies prepare in silence, and the old world prepares to face its final reckoning. This is the story of the Second Arab-Israeli War, the moment when empires fell asleep and the modern Middle East awoke. You're watching Lullaby of Empires, where history speaks softly and the past breathes again. Chapter 1. The Echo of Empires. The guns of the Second World War had long fallen silent, but their echoes still rolled across the world. Europe, once the center of empire, now stood in ruins, its cities broken, its treasuries empty, and its people weary of conquest. The mighty colonial powers of Britain and France, who had once painted the globe in their colors, were shadows of their former selves. Yet in their hearts lingered a quiet delusion, the belief that the sun had not yet set on their empires. But history moves in silence before it roars. In Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, the colonies that had bled and toiled for European wars were awakening. Words like freedom, sovereignty, and self-determination, once confined to political speeches, now stirred in the hearts of millions. And nowhere did that awakening burn brighter than along the banks of the Nile. Egypt had been the jewel of imperial strategy. For Britain, it was the key to the East, the lifeline to India, Australia, and the trade routes that sustained a global empire. At the heart of it all lay a man-made miracle, the Suez Canal, a narrow waterway carved through desert and dream, connecting the Mediterranean to the Red Sea. Since its completion in 1869, it had been more than just a canal. It was the artery through which empire breathed. For nearly a century, Britain had guarded it like a crown. Soldiers patrolled its banks. Warships anchored nearby. The British flag fluttered in the Egyptian sun, not as a guest, but as a master. Even when Egypt declared independence in 1922, the British never truly left. Their troops remained in the Canal Zone, a constant reminder of who still held power. But after the war, everything began to change. The empire's illusion of control was cracking. India, the brightest jewel, had broken away in 1947. Across Africa, independence movements were stirring, and in Egypt, resentment had been simmering for decades. Resentment at foreign troops on Egyptian soil, at a monarchy seen as corrupt, and at a government that seemed powerless before the West. By the early 1952s, Cairo had become a city of contradictions. On one side, British officers in crisp uniforms dined in colonial clubs beside the Nile. On the other, Egyptian soldiers marched through narrow streets, whispering about revolution. The old order felt brittle, like porcelain in trembling hands. Then, in July 1952, the inevitable happened. A group of young military officers calling themselves the Free Officers Movement rose in revolt. They were not politicians, but soldiers, men who had fought, seen defeat, and tasted humiliation. Led by General Mohammed Naguib and a charismatic colonel named Gamal Abdel Nasser, they seized power almost bloodlessly. The corrupt King Farouk fled into exile, his yacht vanishing across the Mediterranean like the departing shadow of an era. Egypt was now a republic, proud, unbound, and restless. At first, the world barely noticed. Britain, still reeling from its own post-war decline, assumed it could manage this new Egypt, as it had the old one, through diplomacy and quiet pressure. But Nasser was not a man to be managed. He was young, intense, and driven by a vision that reached beyond borders. He dreamed of a united Arab world, independent of both East and West. To his people, he was the embodiment of pride. a man who spoke the language of the street, who had risen from poverty to power. To the old powers of Europe, he was something far more dangerous, a symbol that colonial rule could be defied. Nasser understood the language of image and emotion. He appeared on radio broadcasts, his voice firm and resonant, calling on Egyptians to rise from the humiliation of the past. He promised dignity, independence, and strength. His rise came at a time when the Cold War was carving the world into two rival camps, the United States and the Soviet Union, each vying for influence across the newly freed nations. And Egypt, perched between Africa and Asia, was suddenly more than a nation. It was a prize, but the ghost of empire still lingered along the Suez Canal. Tens of thousands of British troops remained there, defending what they called the vital artery of civilization. To Egyptians, it was an insult, a foreign army guarding Egyptian soil. Skirmishes soon broke out between local police and British soldiers. Tensions turned deadly. In the narrow streets of Ismailia and Port Said, blood was spilled. The colonial presence had become untenable. Britain's government, led by Prime Minister Anthony Eden, a man haunted by the legacy of Churchill, struggled to adapt. Eden had grown up in an age when the British Empire ruled the waves. To him, the canal was not just a trade route, it was identity itself. Losing control of it meant losing Britain's place in the world. And that he could not accept. By 1954, Britain reluctantly signed an agreement with Nasser's new government. The British troops would withdraw from Egypt within 2 years. To Eden, it was a temporary retreat, a pause, not an end. To Nasser, it was a quiet victory, proof that the era of empire was fading. When the last British soldiers finally left the canal zone in June 1956, crowds gathered to cheer. Egyptian flags waved in the air, and the streets erupted with chants of freedom. But beneath the celebration, a storm was brewing. The young republic faced immense challenges. Egypt's economy was fragile. Its army was still rebuilding. And while Nasser's popularity soared, his ambitions had alarmed nearly everyone: the West, Israel, and even some of his Arab neighbors. He wanted to build Egypt into a modern power. The symbol of that ambition was the Aswan High Dam, a massive engineering project meant to harness the Nile, generate electricity, and fuel economic growth. Nasser turned first to the United States and Britain for funding. At first, they agreed. But as Nasser began courting the Soviet Union for weapons and political support, Washington grew suspicious. The Cold War paranoia ran deep, and in July 1956, the U.S. abruptly withdrew its offer to fund the dam. To humiliate Nasser was to light a fuse. He needed money, and more importantly, he needed to prove Egypt could stand on its own. So, he made a decision that would shake the world. On the evening of the 26th of July 1956, Nasser stood before a vast crowd in Alexandria. The sun was sinking behind the minarets, and the air was thick with anticipation. He spoke of dignity, of independence, of reclaiming what was Egypt's by right. And then, with calm conviction, he announced, "The Suez Canal is now the property of Egypt. We have nationalized the Suez Canal Company." For a heartbeat, the crowd fell silent and then erupted in thunderous applause. The streets filled with celebration. Men wept, women cheered, and Nasser's name echoed from every wall. But in London and Paris, the news hit like an earthquake. To the British, it was theft, an act of rebellion against their legacy. To the French, already fighting a brutal war in Algeria, it was a dangerous sign of Arab nationalism spreading across their empire. And to Israel, the nationalization of the canal and Egypt's blockade of the Straits of Tiran felt like a tightening noose. The world was changing, and the old empires could not bear it. In private meetings, British ministers whispered of intervention. French generals drafted plans. Israeli intelligence officers weighed their options. By autumn, a secret alliance was forming in the shadows, an alliance that would soon bring fire and thunder to the Sinai desert. The echoes of empire had become footsteps, marching once again toward war. But this time, The world was different. The eyes of Washington and Moscow were watching. The stage was no longer colonial, it was global. And as the world prepared to witness the rebirth of old ambitions, few realized they were also watching their final act. The age of empires was ending not with a surrender, but with a stubborn, echoing fight against time itself. Chapter 2: The Man Called Nasser. In the heart of Cairo, amid the swirl of dust and prayer, a boy once gazed at the world beyond his father's humble post office and dreamed of something greater. His name was Gamal Abdel Nasser, a name that, in time, would carry the weight of millions. He was not born into power. He was not a prince or the son of a general. He was, like most Egyptians of his generation, the child of a colonized land raised beneath the long shadow of empire. He saw British soldiers march through Egyptian streets as though they owned them. He watched as his country's riches, its cotton, its canal, its pride, were siphoned away to distant capitals. These early years carved something into him, something that would never leave, a quiet anger, a deep, unshakable sense of injustice. It was the kind of anger that does not roar but burns slowly, steadily, the kind that shapes a destiny. As a young man, Nasser entered the Enprest Military Academy, one of the few paths open to those seeking both education and purpose. There, he met other men who shared his disillusionment. They were young officers, disciplined but restless, loyal to their country more than to their king. Together, they dreamed of an Egypt that could stand tall, not as a servant of Britain, not as a pawn in foreign hands, but as a nation in its own right. In 1948, when the First Arab-Israeli War broke out, Nasser and many of his comrades were sent to fight in Palestine. What they saw there changed them forever. The Arab armies, divided by politics and pride, were crushed by the newly formed Israeli Defense Forces. Egypt's leadership, corrupt and disorganized, sent men into battle without proper weapons or strategy. Nasser saw Egyptian soldiers die needlessly, and he felt the sting of humiliation, not from the enemy, but from within. When he returned home, the young officer was no longer a dreamer. He was a man with a mission. He began to gather like-minded officers, forming the nucleus of what would become the Free Officers Movement. Their goal was simple but monumental: to end the corruption that had poisoned Egypt and to throw off the last remnants of British control. They worked in secret, building their strength quietly, waiting for the right moment. That moment came in the summer of 1952. The monarchy had grown decadent, the streets restless. One night, as Cairo slept, the free officers made their move. They took control of key government buildings and surrounded the royal palace. By dawn, the old world had fallen. King Farouk, bloated and disillusioned, was forced to abdicate. He sailed away into exile, leaving behind a country that no longer needed kings. At first, General Mohammed Naguib became the face of the new republic. But behind him, it was Nasser, younger, quieter, but far more determined, who guided its course. Within 2 years, he emerged as the true leader of Egypt. The world did not know what to make of him. The British saw a nationalist upstart. The Americans saw an opportunity, perhaps even a potential ally in the Cold War's struggle for influence. The Soviets, too, watched with interest. But Nasser belonged to none of them. He once told an aide, "We will walk our own path, not east, not west, but forward." In the early years of his rule, Nasser's focus was rebuilding. Egypt was still poor, still scarred by years of exploitation. He nationalized industries, launched land reforms, and poured resources into education. He envisioned a modern, self-sufficient Egypt, one where children would grow up proud of who they were, not ashamed of what their country had become. Yet power, even when born from noble intentions, changes those who hold it. Nasser was no exception. The young colonel who had once whispered of freedom now ruled with iron discipline. Political opposition was crushed, dissenting voices silenced. He justified it as necessary, a safeguard against chaos. And perhaps, in a nation still fragile, it was. But it also marked the beginning of a transformation, from revolutionary to ruler. Still, to the streets of Cairo, Nasser remained a hero. His speeches, broadcast through crackling radios across the Arab world, carried a kind of magic. He spoke not only to Egyptians, but to all Arabs, from Baghdad to Damascus, from Amman to Casablanca. He spoke of unity, of dignity, of throwing off the chains of colonial rule. He called it pan-Arabism, the belief that the Arab nations, divided by borders drawn by colonial hands, could one day stand together as one people. To millions, this dream was intoxicating. To Western powers, it was terrifying. By the mid-1950s, Nasser had become more than a leader. He was a symbol, a living defiance of Western dominance. When he walked among crowds, people reached for his hands as though touching him might transfer some of his strength. Women wept, men shouted his name, but not Tumant. Everyone was celebrating. To Britain and France, Nasser's rise was a direct threat to their fading influence. To Israel, his fiery rhetoric and military buildup were alarming. He had refused to recognize Israel's existence and had begun allowing Palestinian Fedayeen guerrilla fighters to operate from Egyptian-held Gaza, launching raids across the border. The region was growing tense, and Nasser's ambitions made it even more volatile. He sought weapons to modernize his army, turning to the United States first. But Washington hesitated, fearing it would upset Israel. So Nasser looked elsewhere to the Soviet bloc. In 1955, he struck a massive arms deal with Czechoslovakia, a satellite of Moscow. The agreement stunned the West. Overnight, Egypt became the most heavily armed Arab state in the region, equipped with Soviet tanks, planes, and guns. To London and Washington, this was proof that Nasser was sliding into the Soviet camp. To Nasser, it was simply pragmatism. The world was divided, and Egypt needed allies. He would take help from whichever side offered it, without surrendering independence. Then came the matter of the Aswan High Dam. To most Egyptians, it was not just an engineering project, it was a dream. The dam would control the unpredictable Nile floods, create vast reservoirs of water, and generate enough electricity to power cities and factories. It was, in Nasser's eyes, the key to Egypt's future. He sought funding from both East and West, playing one side against the other. For a time, it seemed to work. The United States and Britain promised financial aid, but when Nasser refused to join their anti-Soviet alliance and recognized Communist China instead, the Americans withdrew their support. It was a public humiliation, and Nasser never forgot humiliation. On the 26th of July, 1956, he stood before a sea of people in Alexandria, his uniform gleaming under the hot Sunday. The crowd chanted his name as he began his speech. He spoke of history, of struggle, of Egypt's right to control its own destiny. And then, in a calm voice that carried across the airwaves, he said the words that changed everything. "We have nationalized the Suez Canal Company." The crowd exploded into cheers. Men danced in the streets, tears streaming down their faces. It was as though Egypt's centuries of subjugation had finally ended in that single moment. But halfway across the world, the reaction was far different. In London, Prime Minister Anthony Eden turned pale with fury. In Paris, French leaders saw their colonial future slipping away. In Tel Aviv, Israeli officials debated what this meant for their security and their survival. To them, Nasser's bold act was not liberation. It was provocation. But to the people of the Middle East, it was electrifying. From Morocco to Iraq, the Arab world rejoiced. Crowds in Damascus and Baghdad waved Egyptian flags. Radio Cairo's broadcasts of Nasser's speeches became the soundtrack of an era. He had done what no one before him had dared. He had defied the old empires and lived to tell the tale. Yet, even as he basked in the glow of triumph, dark clouds gathered on the horizon. Britain and France were not ready to let go of the canal. They began plotting in secret, reaching out to Israel, the enemy of Nasser's Egypt, to form a hidden pact. The stage was being set for a new war, one that would unfold not only across the sands of Sinai, but across the world's television screens and in the chambers of the United Nations. For Nasser, it would be the ultimate test. Could a single man's defiance withstand the weight of empires? Could the dreams of independence survive the guns of three nations? The desert would soon provide the answer. And as night fell over Cairo, the man called Nasser looked out over his city, unaware that in a few short months, the world would call his name in both admiration and fear. Chapter 3. The Canal and the Lope, Crown. The news of Nasser's declaration hit London like a thunderclap. On the evening of July 26, 1956, as the Egyptian leader's voice carried across the radio waves, the British cabinet sat in stunned silence. The Prime Minister, Anthony Eden, lowered the volume on the wireless and stared at his ministers. His face was pale, his hands trembling slightly, not with fear, but with anger. To Eden, the Suez Canal was not merely a waterway. It was the spine of the British Empire, the route that connected Britain's industries to the oil of the Persian Gulf, the trade of Asia, and the influence of Africa. It was the living artery that had once kept the empire's heart beating. And now, in a single sentence, Nasser had seized it. Nationalized, Eden repeated, his voice cold. The word burned in his mouth. To him, it was theft, an act of defiance by a man he had already begun to despise. He saw Nasser not as a nationalist leader, but as another Mussolini, another Hitler, a dictator wrapped in the rhetoric of revolution. He's a madman, Eden muttered, pacing his office late into the night. He must be crushed, or everything we stand for will crumble. But what Britain stood for in 1956 was already fading. The empire that had once ruled over a quarter of humanity was dissolving, one colony at a time. India was gone. The gold of Africa was slipping away. Even at home, post-war austerity had drained the confidence of a people once proud to call themselves imperial. And yet, Eden, educated in the traditions of empire, shaped by Churchill's defiance, could not let go. He believed Britain still had a duty, a destiny, to command the seas and maintain order in the world. The Suez Canal, in his mind, was more than property. It was identity. In Paris, the reaction was just as fierce, but for different reasons. France was trapped in a colonial war in Algeria, a brutal conflict that was draining its treasury and tearing its society apart. To the French government, Nasser was not just another nationalist. He was the enemy behind the enemy, the voice inspiring rebellion across North Africa. Algerian revolutionaries carried his speeches in their pockets, broadcast his words in secret, and saw in him a symbol of liberation. To crush Nasser was to crush the dream of anti-colonial revolt. And so, within hours of his announcement, the governments of Britain and France began to whisper the same thought: Nasser must be removed. But how? Military intervention was politically dangerous. The world had changed. The United Nations stood as the new guardian of peace, and the United States, their former ally, would not easily support colonial-style aggression. Still, Eden's fury burned too deeply to consider restraint. He saw diplomacy as weakness, compromise as betrayal. He called for emergency meetings with France. The two nations began sending envoys back and forth, quietly building a shared strategy, one they could not yet admit aloud. They first tried pressure. Britain froze Egyptian assets. French banks followed suit. Together, they organized the Suez Canal Users Association, hoping to isolate Egypt economically. But Nasser refused to bend. Instead, he doubled down, assuring his people that Egypt would manage the canal efficiently and fairly. To the surprise of many, he was right. Ships continued to pass through the waterway with minimal disruption. Every success only deepened British humiliation. In the smoke-filled rooms of Whitehall, Eden's advisors debated options. Some urged caution, warning that Britain's military was stretched thin, its finances fragile. Others, mostly older men who had served during the empire's peak, demanded action. Lord Mountbatten, the first Sea Lord, warned Eden not to invade, reminding him that the world is not the same as in 1914. Eden scowled. He did not want reminders. He wanted redemption. And redemption, he believed, required force. In the late summer of 1956, secret channels opened between London, Paris, and Tel Aviv. For Israel, the situation was dire. Egypt had closed the Straits of Tiran, blocking Israeli access to the Red Sea, a chokehold on its trade and lifeline to Asia. Egyptian-backed guerrillas, the Fedayeen, were crossing from Gaza, attacking farms and border posts. To Israeli Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion, Nasser's Egypt was not just a rival, it was an existential threat. The interests of the three nations began to align in a grim harmony. Israel wanted security and open trade routes. France wanted to punish the man who fueled its colonial unrest. Britain wanted to reclaim its lost prestige and the canal it believed still rightfully its own. Three nations, three motives, one goal. The idea that began to take shape was as cynical as it was clever. If Israel could be persuaded to strike first, to invade Egypt and move toward the canal, Britain and France could then step in under the guise of peacekeepers. They would demand that both sides withdraw, knowing Egypt would refuse. Then they would intervene militarily not as aggressors, but as mediators, and seize control of the canal zone once again. It was a plan wrapped in deceit but cloaked in legality. The scheme took root in secrecy. In October 1956, representatives from all three nations met in a quiet suburb outside Paris, Sèvres. The meeting was so secret that even many within their own governments knew nothing of it. In a dimly lit room, the delegations huddled around maps of the Sinai. French officials spoke first, promising air support and coordination. The Israelis outlined their invasion strategy, Operation Kadesh, a lightning strike across the desert toward the canal. The British delegation, cautious but eager, refined the political cover story that would mask the true nature of their alliance. Each signed the Sèvres Protocol, a document so explosive that it would remain denied for years. It was the last whisper of empire, a secret pact born of pride, fear, and desperation. While the conspirators plotted, the world went about its business, unaware that history was about to lurch once more toward chaos. In London, the British press began to speak of the Nasser problem. Editorials painted him as reckless, dangerous, unstable. But behind the headlines lay another truth. Britain's government was projecting its own insecurities. The empire that once commanded continents now struggled to influence even a single canal. Eden, exhausted by sleepless nights and the pressure of politics, began to unravel. His health, already weakened by years of stress, faltered. He grew paranoid, convinced that Nasser was orchestrating every challenge to British power from labor strikes at home to unrest abroad. "He must go," he repeated to his cabinet, his voice breaking with conviction. "Nasser must go." Meanwhile, in Cairo, Nasser remained calm. He knew Britain and France were furious. He expected retaliation, economic pressure, perhaps even air raids, but he did not yet know how far they would go. He believed, perhaps naively, that the era of imperial invasion was over, but the world still had lessons to teach him. By late October, the plan was ready. Israeli forces were mobilizing near the Negev. British and French paratroopers stood on alert. Naval fleets assembled in the Mediterranean, their decks gleaming under the sunday. To the world, it seemed routine joint exercises, nothing more. But those who knew the truth felt the air grow heavier by the day. The canal, once a symbol of progress and connection, had become a fuse, one spark, and the whole region would burn. In the drawing rooms of London and Paris, the architects of empire whispered of honor, stability, and order. Yet beneath their words lingered a different emotion, fear. Fear that the world had moved on without them. Fear that their flags, once planted proudly in the sands of Africa and Asia, now fluttered only in memory. As October drew to a close, that fear hardened into resolve. The orders were given. The trap was set. And far across the desert, Israeli engines began to rumble to life. History, once again, was on the march not forward, but backward, toward the ghost of empire's last stand. Chapter 4. Israel's Edge of Survival. The desert at night can seem endless. It stretches in silence, its sands whispering stories older than memory. In that silence, on the eve of war, the Israeli army gathered under a cold, moonlit sky. They were small in number, fewer than 100,000 men, but their purpose burned with desperate clarity. For Israel, survival was not a political slogan, it was existence itself. Barely 8 years had passed since the nation's birth, forged in the ashes of the Holocaust and the chaos of 1948. The First Arab-Israeli War had given it a fragile foothold, a homeland at last, but not peace. Every border was a wound, every neighbor a reminder of unfinished conflict. In Tel Aviv, the air was tense. Cafes buzzed with rumors, families whispered over candlelight. To outsiders, Israel was young and defiant. To those who lived within its borders, it was a miracle, constantly on the verge of vanishing. Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion, Israel's founding father, carried that burden more heavily than anyone. At 70, his hair had turned to silver, but his mind remained sharp, restless, and haunted by history. He believed deeply that Israel could never depend on others for its safety. "If we do not defend ourselves," he once said, "no one will." And yet, in 1956, Israel's isolation felt absolute. Its ships were barred from passing through the Suez Canal, and the Straits of Tiran lifelines for trade and access to Asia. From the south, Egypt's blockade strangled its economy. From the west, the Gaza Strip had become a launch pad for Egyptian-trained fedayeen, raiders who slipped across the border at night, planting mines, ambushing convoys, and disappearing back into the dunes. Every Israeli village along the frontier lived in fear of sudden attack. Every siren, every distant gunshot, stirred memories of 1948, the war that had nearly destroyed the new nation before it had begun. For Ben-Gurion, Egypt under Gamal Abdel Nasser represented an existential threat. Nasser's voice, broadcast across the Arab world, called openly for Israel's destruction. His growing alliance with the Soviet Union and his recent arms deal with Czechoslovakia had transformed Egypt into the best-equipped military in the Middle East. To Israel, it felt like a tightening noose. In military briefings, Israeli generals pored over maps of the Sinai Peninsula. The desert, vast and unforgiving, separated Israel from the Suez Canal and the Egyptian heartland. To cross it would be a monumental task, a gamble of survival. Yet, as the weeks passed, the choice seemed increasingly clear: strike first, or wait to be surrounded. The man who would shape that strike was Moshe Dayan, the chief of staff, a soldier of legend, known for the black eye patch that marked him as both warrior and survivor. Dayan had fought in every battle of Israel's young life. He knew the land like few others, and he knew the value of surprise. To him, hesitation was death. "We must move swiftly," he told his commanders. "We cannot allow Nasser to choose the time or place of our next war." Dayan's philosophy was brutal but simple. Fight the wars of tomorrow before they begin today. In secret, plans took shape under the name Operation Kadesh. The goal was clear: invade the Sinai, destroy Egyptian forces, and reopen the Straits of Tiran. But there was a second, hidden purpose, one known only to a handful of leaders. Through channels quietly opened by the French, Israel had entered into covert discussions with Britain and France. At first, Ben-Gurion was wary. Israel had never trusted the old empires. Both had abandoned Jewish refugees before 1948 and sought favor with the Arab world. But this time, desperation and opportunity aligned. France, bleeding from its colonial war in Algeria, saw in Israel a willing partner against Nasser, the man they believed was fueling rebellion across their empire. Britain, humiliated by Nasser's nationalization of the canal, needed a pretext to strike without appearing the aggressor. And Israel, cornered by blockade and raids, saw a chance to break free. So began the secret alliance, the Sèvres Protocol, conceived in whispers and sealed with handshakes no camera would ever see. The plan was intricate. Israel would invade Egypt, advancing rapidly toward the Suez Canal. Britain and France would then issue a public ultimatum to both sides to cease fire and withdraw from the canal zone. Egypt, certain to refuse, would provide the justification for Anglo-French intervention. Together, they would restore order and, in doing so, crush Nasser's Egypt. For the Western powers, it was a geopolitical maneuver. For Israel, it was survival. In the Negev desert, preparations began quietly. Units were mobilized under the cover of routine exercises. Tanks were camouflaged with nets and desert paint. Pilots studied the winds that swept across Sinai, their aircraft humming softly in the hangars. Paratroopers, many of them barely 20, whispered goodbyes to their families, pretending it was just another training mission. The men of the 202nd Paratrooper Brigade, led by a young and daring colonel named Ariel Sharon, were among those chosen for the most dangerous part of the mission, a deep strike into Sinai's interior. Sharon, intense and ambitious, had already earned a reputation for courage that bordered on recklessness. His orders were simple and impossible. Parachute near the Mitla Pass, a narrow gorge in the central desert, and hold it until reinforcements arrived. He knew what it meant. It meant isolation, encirclement, and almost certain battle. But Sharon, like many in the IDF, believed that boldness was Israel's only real weapon. On the evening of the 29th of October 1956, the desert sky blazed red with the setting. Sunday, the men gathered quietly beside their vehicles. Radios crackled, engines idled. Somewhere in the distance, the call to evening prayer drifted faintly from Egyptian villages. Then came the order. At precisely 3 p.m., Israeli aircraft roared into the sky. Their targets, Egyptian command posts, airfields, and communication lines. Dust and flame rose over the desert. At almost the same moment, paratroopers began their descent from Dakotas and Noretla's transports, their parachutes blossoming like white flowers against the fading light. Operation Kadesh had begun. In the following hours, chaos swept across the Sinai. Israeli armor surged through the sands, striking swiftly at Egyptian positions. The 9th Infantry Brigade advanced toward Ras el Nakab, capturing it by midnight without a single casualty. Further north, Sharon's paratroopers secured the high ridges around Jebel Haitan, enduring fierce counterattacks but holding their ground. In Tel Aviv, the government waited in tense silence. Every report, every coded transmission, carried both hope and dread. The public knew nothing. To them, the night seemed quiet, almost peaceful. But by dawn, rumors began to spread, whispers of something moving in the desert. To Israel's soldiers, the fighting felt like déjà vu, the ghost of 1,948 reborn. Yet this time, the stakes were even higher. They were not fighting to create a homeland. They were fighting to keep one. Through dust and exhaustion, the IDF pushed deeper. By October 31st, Egyptian resistance began to falter. Columns of tanks and trucks stretched for miles, rumbling through the sand. Above them, the sky filled with the thunder of jets, not only Israeli, but soon British and French. The deception phase had begun. In London and Paris, the ultimatum was issued just as planned. It demanded that both Egypt and Israel withdraw from the canal zone within 12 hours. Nasser, furious but unbowed, refused. And with that refusal, Britain and France declared their intervention not as conquerors, they claimed, but as peacekeepers. For Israel, the strategy had worked. Its advance was now shielded by Western firepower. But there was little sense of triumph, only grim relief. Every soldier knew how fragile their success was. If the superpowers intervened, if the United States or the Soviet Union took a stand, everything could collapse in an instant. And so, as the world began to stir in confusion, the small nation pressed on. In the Sinai, exhausted troops dug into the dunes. In Cairo, Nasser prepared to fight back. And in London, the old lions of empire sharpened their claws for one last strike, unaware that their own power was already bleeding away. The desert, indifferent and eternal, watched it all in silence. For Israel, this was more than a war of politics. It was a prayer whispered in the language of survival, the desperate plea of a nation that had seen too much death to ever allow itself to be cornered again. But in its alliance with the fading empires of Europe, Israel had stepped into something larger than survival. It had become part of an old struggle, one that would soon spiral far beyond the desert's horizon, drawing in the eyes and anger of the entire world. Chapter 5. Secrets in Sèvres. Far from the burning sands of the Middle East, in the quiet autumn air of France, a meeting was about to change the course of history. It would not take place in the grand halls of diplomacy or the marble chambers of parliaments, but in a secluded villa on the outskirts of Paris, a place chosen precisely for its silence. The year was 1956, and the villa stood in Sèvres, a leafy suburb hidden behind hedgerows and unmarked gates. In the world, it was just another quiet home in the French countryside. But for 1 week, it became the nerve center of a secret alliance, one that dared to defy the United Nations, the United States, and the fragile peace of the post-war world. Inside, the air was thick with cigarette smoke and secrecy. Maps of the Sinai Peninsula were spread across polished tables. Coffee cups sat half-finished beside stacks of telegrams, marked confidential. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, the only witness to what was unfolding. 3 delegations had gathered under the code of silence. From Britain came Foreign Secretary Selwyn Lloyd, a man known for his composure but burdened by the impossible task of defending a fading empire. From France, Foreign Minister Christian Pineau, whose eyes betrayed both weariness and fury. His nation was trapped in the quagmire of Algeria, and he blamed Nasser for fanning its flames. And from Israel, the smallest but most determined of the 3, came Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion, Defense Minister Shimon Peres, and Chief of Staff Moshe Dayan, their presence cloaked in secrecy so deep that even their own parliament would remain unaware for years. The meeting had one purpose: to decide how to bring down Gamal Abdel Nasser, quietly, swiftly, and under the guise of international law. The French delegation hosted. The British led the legal gymnastics. The Israelis, pragmatic and direct, provided the spark. Ben-Gurion, though short in stature, commanded the room with quiet authority. His thick white hair framed a face that carried the weight of survival. "We cannot live under siege," he said simply. "If Nasser controls the canal and the straits, he controls our lifeline. We cannot wait for his next move." Pineau nodded. "Nor can we allow him to humiliate us further. Algeria burns because of him. His voice reaches our soldiers' ears more powerfully than our own." Lloyd adjusted his glasses. "And Britain," he added, "cannot stand by while a dictator seizes what is ours by right. But," he paused, glancing toward the map, "we must not appear as aggressors. The Americans would never forgive it. We need a pretext, something that makes intervention seem inevitable." The silence that followed was heavy, almost tangible. Then Perez leaned forward, his tone calm, deliberate. "What if," he began, "Israel were to attack first?" All eyes turned to him. "If we move into Sinai," he continued, "toward the canal, you could issue an ultimatum to both sides, demanding withdrawal. Egypt would refuse, naturally. And then, as neutral powers, you would intervene. On paper, you would be peacekeepers. In practice, you would be our allies." It was a perfect illusion, legality, crafted to mask conquest. Lloyd exhaled slowly, almost relieved. "A brilliant plan," he murmured. Pineau smiled faintly. The room began to hum with cautious excitement, but Ben-Gurion was not smiling. He sat back, eyes narrowed, deep in thought. "You speak of a simple operation," he said quietly, "but it is not simple. You will strike from the air and sea. We will fight in the desert. Israel will bear the weight of this war. If the world condemns it, if Washington turns against us, we will stand alone." The French minister nodded. "You will not stand alone," he promised. "France will cover your skies. Our aircraft will protect your cities if needed." For a moment, even Dayan, the hardened general, hesitated. He knew what such promises were worth in politics. But the logic was undeniable. For the first time, Israel was not just reacting to threats, it was shaping the battlefield. The discussions continued late into the night. They debated troop movements, timetables, and diplomatic cover stories. Every word was chosen with care, every phrase wrapped in deniability. The French scribes prepared a document short, deliberate, and devastatingly clear. It became known as the Suez Protocol. In essence, it outlined a sequence of events designed to deceive the world. Israel would invade Sinai, advancing rapidly toward the canal. Britain and France would issue their ultimatum. Egypt would reject it. The peacekeeping forces of Britain and France would intervene, seize the canal zone, and topple Nasser's regime. The ink dried, and with it, the last vestiges of restraint. Before dawn, the delegations signed. Each pen stroke was a quiet act of defiance against the new order of the world, a final assertion that the old empires could still dictate destiny. When it was done, the room fell silent again. Outside, the first light of morning touched the trees of Suez, turning the mist to gold. For a moment, it was peaceful, as though history itself held its breath. But beneath that calm, something irreversible had begun. The Israelis returned home, their mission clear. The British and French returned to their governments, shrouded in secrecy. Even their own parliaments were kept in the dark. Publicly, they spoke of diplomacy, of maintaining peace and stability. Privately, fleets were mobilized, air crews briefed, and paratroopers put on standby. To the world, it seemed like calm. To those who knew the truth, it was the quiet before the storm. In London, Anthony Eden rehearsed his speeches in front of a mirror. His health was deteriorating. Insomnia and stress etched deep lines across his face. Yet he clung to the belief that this operation would restore Britain's greatness. "History," he told his advisors, "will understand what we have done." In Paris, the general spoke in low voices of honor, of retribution, of lost pride, reclaimed. To them, the coming war was not about Egypt. It was about France's fading empire. And in Tel Aviv, the IDF continued its preparations. The men were told little of the politics behind their orders. They did not need to know. The mission was the same as it had always been: to fight, to survive, to endure. As the days shortened and October drew near, the world unknowingly drifted toward confrontation. In Cairo, Nasser celebrated the success of his nationalization, unaware that a secret pact thousands of miles away had already sealed his fate. Ships moved quietly through the Mediterranean, gathering under false pretenses. French bombers were relocated to Cyprus. British carriers loaded fuel and ammunition. The Israeli Air Force drilled relentlessly, their pilots memorizing the terrain of Sinai from aerial maps and sketches. The stage was built, the actors in place. And yet, beneath the layers of strategy and deception, something more fragile persisted: doubt. Even among those who had signed the Suez Protocol, there were whispers of unease. Could such an old-fashioned conspiracy succeed in the age of radio and television? Could the empires of yesterday truly reshape the world of tomorrow? None dared to speak those questions aloud. In the villa at Suez, after everyone had gone, a cleaning woman found a map left behind its corners, marked with cigarette burns, its ink smudged by the sweat of restless hands. She did not know what it meant. She folded it neatly, placed it in a drawer, and closed it. History, however, does not forget so easily. A week later, across the deserts of Sinai, the first paratroopers would leap from the sky. The secret of Sèvres would burst into fire and dust, and the old empires, in their quest to revive the past, would instead write their final elegy. Chapter 6. Operation Kadesh. The desert awakens differently when war begins. There is no dawn chorus, no soft light breaking through the dunes. Instead, the air trembles heavy with anticipation, and the silence hums like a held breath before thunder. In the late afternoon of October 29, 1956, the order went out. Operation Kadesh was underway. For months, it had existed only as ink on maps and whispers in closed rooms. Now it roared to life in the dry wind of the Sinai. The Israeli Air Force struck first. Fighter jets, sleek, low, and fast, screamed over the desert, their engines slicing through the heat. They targeted Egyptian communication centers, supply convoys, and air bases. The goal was not destruction alone, but confusion to blind the Egyptian command before they could react. On the ground, the 9th Infantry Brigade, under Colonel Avraham Yoffi, rolled out from the Negev toward Ras al-Nakab. Their mission was simple but vital: open the southern gateway into the Sinai. They advanced under the moonlight, engines muffled, headlights off, guided only by compass and instinct. By midnight, Ras al-Nakab was theirs, taken without a single casualty. Further north, under the pale stars, Colonel Ariel Sharon prepared his 202nd Paratrooper Brigade. His men stood ready beside their aircraft, faces dusted with sand, eyes gleaming with focus. They were about to leap deep behind enemy lines, into one of the most dangerous missions of the war, the Mitla Pass. The Mitla Pass was a natural fortress, a narrow gorge twisting through the Sinai Mountains. Whoever held it controlled the central routes of the peninsula. Sharon's paratroopers were to land east of the pass, cut off Egyptian reinforcements, and hold the ground until the armored divisions arrived. At 3 p.m., the first planes took off from Israeli airfields. The rumble of their engines rolled across the desert like distant thunder. As they neared their target, the rear hatches opened, and hundreds of paratroopers leapt into the fading sky. Their parachutes unfurled like white blossoms, drifting silently toward the desert floor. The landing went smoother than expected. Within hours, the paratroopers established control of the area, setting up defenses and marking drop zones for supplies. But they were isolated nearly 70 miles from the nearest Israeli line, surrounded by enemy territory. The plan depended on speed. If the armored columns did not reach them quickly, they would be crushed. In Cairo, Egyptian officers scrambled to make sense of the reports pouring in. At first, they believed it was a limited raid, a border skirmish, perhaps a provocation. But as dawn broke on October 30th, the truth became clear. Israeli armor was moving fast, too fast. Tanks and half-tracks poured into the Sinai from 3 directions, slicing through the desert with surgical precision. To the west, Colonel Joseph Harpaz's 4th Brigade stormed the fortified town of Al-Qusayma, using a pincer maneuver to encircle and overwhelm its defenders. After hours of fierce fighting, the city fell just after 3 a.m. The Egyptian garrison, outflanked and exhausted, melted into the desert. Northward, the 27th Armored Brigade, commanded by Colonel Hayam Bar-Lev, clashed with Egyptian positions near Rafah, a key crossroads linking Gaza to the interior. The Egyptians had fortified it heavily: trenches, barbed wire, and bunkers dug into the dunes. But the Israelis were relentless. Using the element of surprise and superior maneuvering, they broke through the defenses after a 3-hour fight, leaving the road to Al Arish open. In the central front, Sharon's paratroopers were facing their own trial. Egyptian forces, realizing the strategic importance of the Mitla Pass, launched counterattacks. Wave after wave of infantry and tanks surged against the Israeli perimeter. The desert shook with artillery fire. The sky flashed orange and red. Sharon, ever bold, made a fateful decision. Without waiting for reinforcements, he ordered his men to assault the pass itself, a move that defied orders, but matched his instinct. The fighting was brutal. The gorge became a killing ground, its narrow walls echoing with gunfire and shouts. By nightfall, the Israelis had secured the high ground, but at a terrible cost, dozens of lives lost in a place that offered little strategic gain. Sharon would later be both praised and criticized for his recklessness, but in that moment, courage was the only currency that mattered. His men had done what few thought possible. They had seized the Mitla Pass from one of the strongest armies in the region. To the north, the advance continued. Israeli armor moved like quicksilver, bypassing strongpoints and cutting supply lines. The goal was not to occupy it, was to paralyze. Egyptian units, cut off from communication, began to retreat in disorder. By October 31st, the Sinai was aflame with movement. In less than 48 hours, Israel had achieved what most believed impossible. It had broken Egypt's outer defenses, seized key positions, and advanced deep toward the Suez Canal. Then, as planned, the next act of the conspiracy began. In London and Paris, the governments of Britain and France issued their ultimatum, a statement of false neutrality that dripped with irony. They demanded that both sides, Egypt and Israel, withdraw from the canal zone within 12 hours, or face intervention to ensure free navigation. The world watched in confusion. How could Britain and France suddenly act as peacekeepers in a conflict they had shown no interest in before? The United Nations called for calm, but the ultimatum expired without response. Egypt, of course, refused. To Nasser, it was not mediation, it was blackmail. "We will not yield," he declared in Cairo. "We will fight for our land, for our dignity, for every drop of the Nile." That was exactly what London and Paris were waiting for. Within hours, British and French bombers took to the skies. Their targets, Egyptian airfields, command posts, and radar stations. The illusion of neutrality vanished beneath the roar of engines and the glow of burning hangars. The so-called peacekeeping mission had become open war. For the soldiers in the Sinai, none of it mattered. They fought in the same dust, under the same burning sun, unaware of the speeches and lies swirling above them. For the Israelis, the arrival of Western air power was both blessing and danger. It protected them for now, but it also tied their victory to foreign motives they could not control. By November 1st, the Egyptian army began to crumble. Those withdrawing from Rafah met others fleeing from Kataf and Abu Uwaila, forming chaotic convoys that stretched for miles. Many ran out of fuel or water, their vehicles abandoned in the sand. The Sinai became a graveyard of machines, silent, half-buried monuments to the speed of modern war. In Gaza, Israeli infantry stormed the city after bitter urban fighting. The 11th Infantry Brigade and 37th Armored Division fought street by street, facing snipers in windows and ambushes in alleys. After 58 hours, Gaza fell. The streets lay quiet, except for the distant echo of boots on broken stone. To the south, the 9th Infantry Brigade advanced along the coast toward Sharm el-Sheikh, the fortress guarding the Straits of Tiran. Egyptian commander Said Zaki had dug in, confident the terrain would favor defense. But after days of bombardment artillery by day, airstrikes by night, the position collapsed. On November 5th, at 9:30 a.m., Zaki surrendered. The straits were open once more. Israel had achieved every military objective it had set out to accomplish. But in victory lay the seeds of peril. As the smoke cleared, the world's attention shifted. Newspapers across Europe and America erupted with outrage. The United States, caught off guard by its allies' deception, demanded an immediate halt to the invasion. The Soviet Union threatened grave consequences, even hinting at rocket attacks on London and Paris. The three nations that had conspired in Sèvres now found themselves cornered. Their plan exposed, their legitimacy shattered. In Cairo, Nasser, though battered and bloodied, refused to yield. He appeared on national radio, his voice steady, declaring Egypt victorious in spirit. "They may take our land," he said, "but they cannot take our will." Across the Arab world, his defiance turned defeat into legend. And in the Sinai, among the drifting sands and still smoking wreckage, Israeli soldiers stood silent, exhausted, and uncertain. They had fought with precision, courage, and purpose, but now their future lay not in their own hands, but in the hands of distant powers and global politics. The desert had been conquered, but the peace was already slipping away. In the days to come, the roar of jet engines would fade, replaced by the quieter, colder voices of diplomacy. And as the armies withdrew, the question lingered. Who had truly won, the soldiers who seized the ground, or the leader who refused to surrender it? The answer, like the desert wind, was still shifting. Chapter 7. The Desert Storm. The night before the storm, the Mediterranean was unnervingly calm. Ships from Britain and France floated in the dark waters off Egypt's coast, vast silhouettes against the faint shimmer of moonlight. On their decks, soldiers stood in silence, faces pale beneath their helmets. The salty air mingling with the metallic scent of oil and tension. They had been told they were peacekeepers. They knew, in truth, they were invaders. It was October 31st, 1956. The ultimatum had expired. Egypt had refused to comply. And now, in the eyes of London and Paris, the time for words was over. Far to the east, in Cairo, sirens wailed as people rushed through dim streets, searching for safety. Parents clutched children, prayers echoed from minarets. For them, the war had already begun, though they had done nothing to start it. In the skies above, British Canberra bombers appeared first, small, fast, and silver, against the stars. They carried no flags, only intent. Within moments, the quiet night exploded in light. Airfields across the Canal Zone and the Nile Delta were engulfed in fire. Runways cracked open under the impact of bombs. Hangars disintegrated into sparks. Egyptian aircraft, many still parked in neat rows, were obliterated before their pilots could even reach them. By dawn, nearly 200 planes lay twisted in smoke. The Egyptian Air Force, proud and newly modernized, was crippled before it ever took flight. From the bridge of the British carrier Eagle, an admiral watched the horizon glow red and whispered, "We have control of the skies." It was true. But it was also an illusion. Control of the air meant little if the world below was slipping away. As the bombardment continued, Allied propaganda called it a limited operation. The official line was that Britain and France were acting as impartial powers, seeking to protect the canal from chaos. Yet every Egyptian watching the sky knew otherwise. These were the same flags that had once ruled their land, the same powers now returning under a different name. In London, Anthony Eden sat in his office, listening to the reports. The operation was moving precisely as planned. On paper, it was victory clean, efficient, justified. Yet Eden's reflection in the window looked older, wearier, as though he sensed the cost no ledger could record. "We are not aggressors," he murmured to himself, a phrase he would repeat again and again, as if repetition might make it true. Meanwhile, in Paris, the mood was less troubled. French generals saw the attack as redemption, a strike against Nasser, the man they blamed for Algeria's rebellion and for mocking their fading empire. In their minds, this was justice, wrapped in smoke and flame. But in the desert, justice looked very different. On the morning of November 5th, the next phase began, Operation Musketeer, the Anglo-French invasion of Egypt's northern coast. The plan was bold and brutal. Paratroopers would drop west of Port Said, securing key positions before a full amphibious assault. Once control was not established, armored divisions would push down the canal, linking up with Israeli forces advancing from Sinai. It was Empire reborn on paper. At 4:15 a.m., the first British aircraft took off from Cyprus. In their holds, paratroopers of the 3rd Battalion, Parachute Regiment sat in silence, hands gripping rifles, eyes fixed on the floor. They were veterans, many from families that had fought in Europe's wars. Few understood why they were now flying into another one that felt more like a memory than a mission. The jump came just after dawn. Hundreds of parachutes blossomed over the desert like drifting snow. They landed west of Port Said, securing the Gamil airfield within an hour. To the southeast, French paratroopers dropped near Raswa, capturing waterworks and key bridges. From above, the scene looked clinical, like chess pieces moving in perfect order. But on the ground, it was chaos. Egyptian defenders, local soldiers, police, even civilians, opened fire from rooftops and alleyways. The paratroopers answered with machine guns and mortars. Smoke rose from the narrow streets as the old colonial quarter turned into a battlefield. By mid-morning, Port Fuad, across the canal from Port Said, was under French control. The sound of gunfire echoed over the water, carried by the wind like distant thunder. In Cairo, Nasser refused to flee. He stood before his ministers, calm but unyielding. "We fight for every inch," he said. "Let them come. The world will see them for what they are." And indeed, the world was watching. Across Europe, protests erupted. In London, crowds gathered outside Downing Street, shouting, "No war for oil," and "End the invasion." In Washington, President Eisenhower, furious that his allies had acted without him, condemned the operation. In Moscow, Nikita Khrushchev went further, threatening rocket attacks on Western capitals if the aggression did not cease. The Suez operation, meant to display power, was, instead, exposing weakness. Yet the soldiers at Port Said could not know this. They fought on, street by street. British Marines advanced through clouds of dust, supported by tanks that clattered over shattered cobblestones. The sun beat down on walls pockmarked by gunfire. Civilians fled, carrying white sheets tied to sticks. By noon, the Allies had seized the harbor. By afternoon, they controlled most of the city's northern districts. The Egyptian defenders were retreating south, regrouping near the canal. From offshore, the bombardment resumed, naval shells screaming through the air, striking warehouses and docks. Fires raged out of control, smoke rising like black pillars into the sky. One British sailor later wrote in his diary, "The city looked like it was bleeding." For the troops, victory felt hollow. Every step forward revealed devastation, homes destroyed, families displaced, children crying amid rubble. Some soldiers offered water to civilians. Others, hardened by fear and orders, pushed them aside. By evening, Allied commanders prepared to push further down the canal. But time was slipping away. Reports of global outrage filled the radios. The United Nations had called for an emergency session. The Americans were preparing economic retaliation against Britain and France. The Soviets had begun moving forces in Eastern Europe. It was no longer just about Egypt. The Suez conflict had become a global crisis, a spark in a world already divided by the Cold War. Still, the orders came. Before dawn on November 6th, British Marines launched their amphibious landing at Port Said. Waves crashed against the landing craft as they surged toward the beach. Helicopters, used in combat for the first time in history, hovered overhead, dropping reinforcements into the smoke. As the first Marines reached shore, Egyptian defenders opened fire. Bullets struck the water, sending up bursts of spray. The sound was deafening. Engines, artillery, the whine of planes overhead. It was the noise of an empire refusing to admit its age. By mid-morning, British forces had secured the beachhead and pushed inland. Tanks rolled through the streets, crushing barricades of sandbags and overturned cars. Civilians huddled in doorways, watching in disbelief as foreign soldiers once again marched through their city. Then, suddenly, the advance stopped. Orders crackled over the radio not to halt for tactical reasons, but political ones. A ceasefire was imminent. At midnight on November 6th, under immense pressure from Washington and the United Nations, Britain and France agreed to stop all military operations. The soldiers froze where they stood. Some cheered. Others stared at the ground, unsure if they had won or lost. In truth, neither side understood what had just happened. In Cairo, as the news spread, crowds poured into the streets. Egyptians celebrated not a battlefield victory, but survival itself. Against three great powers, their nation still stood. In London, the mood was far darker. The press called it a humiliation. Anthony Eden's government wavered. Within months, he would resign a broken man, his health and career consumed by the war he had believed would save Britain's pride. In Paris, the illusion of restored empire evaporated just as quickly. France had gained nothing. The war in Algeria raged on. The world now saw its colonial ambitions as relics. And in Tel Aviv, Israel's military triumph was overshadowed by diplomatic isolation. Though it had conquered Sinai in a matter of days, it was soon forced by international pressure to withdraw. The Desert Storm had passed, leaving behind only silence and the unmistakable sound of empires fading into history. For the British and the French, it was the end of something unspoken, the final acknowledgement that their age of command was over. For Egypt, it was the birth of a new identity, proud, defiant, unbowed. The Suez Canal still flowed, indifferent to flags and treaties, but through its waters, the tide of history had turned. Chapter 8: The British Ultimatum. In the cold, gray morning of November 1st, 1956, London felt uneasy. The streets were quiet, damp with rain, the fog settling low over the Thames. Beneath that fog, a war was unfolding half a world away, one that Britain's leaders believed would restore their nation's pride. But as the city stirred awake, it was already clear that pride had become something fragile, something slipping through their hands. Inside 10 Downing Street, Prime Minister Anthony Eden stood before a fireplace, his reflection flickering in the glass. His face, once handsome and confident, was drawn and pale. The newspapers on his desk told two stories, one of victory, another of condemnation. Egyptian Air Force crushed, read one headline. Beside it, World denounces Anglo-French aggression. He could feel the contradiction tightening around him like a noose. Eden had waited his entire career for this moment, to step from Churchill's shadow and lead Britain as its own man. He had inherited the legend of victory, the belief that Britain was still a moral empire, firm, fair, and unyielding. But now, as smoke rose over the Suez Canal and protests filled London's streets, he could not shake the feeling that something was wrong. The ultimatum, the formal demand that Egypt withdraw from the canal or face invasion, had been his plan, his masterpiece of diplomatic deception. To Eden, it was elegant, a way to reclaim the canal while pretending to keep the peace. He had imagined it as a statement of strength, one last command from a nation that once ruled the waves. But the world was no longer listening. Across the Atlantic, in Washington, President Dwight Eisenhower read the ultimatum with disbelief. The British, French, and Israelis had conspired without his knowledge, and worse, had chosen the eve of his re-election campaign to start a war. Eisenhower, a man who had commanded the liberation of Europe, was furious. "They've lied to me," he said, throwing the papers onto his desk. "Eden's gone mad. He's living in 1913. He wasn't entirely wrong." Eden saw the Suez Canal not just as a strategic asset, but as a symbol of Britain itself, the last thread connecting the modern world to an empire that had once stretched from Cairo to Calcutta. Losing it to Nasser, the defiant colonel who spoke like a king, was more than a political blow. It was personal. To Eden, Nasser was not simply a nationalist. He was another dictator, another test of will. And Eden had already decided he would not be the man who appeased another strongman. He told his cabinet, "We cannot allow him to get away with it. If we do, we are finished." Around the polished table in the cabinet room, the ministers nodded, some eagerly, others in silence. Many of them had doubts about the secrecy, the timing, the cost. But few dared to challenge the Prime Minister directly. Eden's temper had grown unpredictable. He was exhausted, sustained by pills and endless cups of coffee. The strain of months of deceit and negotiation had begun to eat away at him. "History will vindicate us," he said again, though his voice lacked conviction. That afternoon, he rehearsed the ultimatum to be read publicly. Britain and France, he declared, would act to separate the belligerents and ensure the free passage of shipping through the canal. To the casual listener, it sounded like diplomacy. To those who knew the truth, it was theater. When the ultimatum was delivered to Cairo, Nasser rejected it without hesitation. "Egypt will not bow to threats," he said. "Let them come." It was the response Eden had expected and the one he secretly desired. That night, British and French bombers roared into the skies. Within hours, the first explosions echoed over the desert. Eden watched from London, listening to military briefings as if they were confessions. He had wanted Nasser gone humiliated, deposed, perhaps even dead. But as reports came in of civilian casualties and burning cities, a chill crept into his heart. By the second day, the scale of global outrage was undeniable. In New York, the United Nations General Assembly convened an emergency session. One delegate after another rose to condemn the invasion. The American ambassador spoke sternly of colonial arrogance. The Indian Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru, once Britain's subject, called it an affront to the world's conscience. In Moscow, Nikita Khrushchev seized the moment. He condemned the imperialist attack on a sovereign nation and hinted with calculated menace that the Soviet Union could retaliate with missiles. It was a bluff, perhaps, but an effective one. Britain's people, weary of war, had no appetite for another confrontation that might end in nuclear fire. In London, protests grew louder. Crowds gathered outside Parliament, holding banners that read, "Hands off Egypt" and "End colonial rule." Among them were veterans of the Second World War, shouting that they had not fought Hitler just to see their government behave like one. Eden closed his curtains and tried not to listen. He turned instead to his advisors, men like Selwyn Lloyd and Harold Macmillan, who whispered reassurances even as the ground crumbled beneath them. Macmillan, once Eden's ally, now began to shift uneasily, sensing opportunity in the Prime Minister's weakness. At home, the pound sterling was collapsing. Eisenhower had quietly ordered the U.S. Treasury to block emergency loans to Britain, choking the financial lifeline that the empire had long depended on. "Withdraw," the Americans urged. "Withdraw now, or we will not save your economy." Eden hesitated. He had won battles, but lost the world. His dream of restored power had turned into humiliation, a spectacle of lost days, defiance that left Britain isolated, mocked, and nearly bankrupt. In the early hours of November 6th, his aides found him pacing his office, still in his dressing gown, a telegram crumpled in his fist. "We've been betrayed," he muttered, "by everyone, even the Americans." It wasn't betrayal, it was reality catching up. By dawn, the United Nations had voted overwhelmingly for a ceasefire. Eisenhower demanded compliance. The Commonwealth nations, Canada, India, and Australia, distanced themselves. Even British newspapers, once loyal, turned critical. "The last illusion of empire has died in the desert," wrote one editorial. Eden had no choice. At midnight, under immense international pressure, Britain and France ordered a halt to all military operations. The ultimatum that had begun the war now ended it, a perfect circle of irony. In Parliament the next morning, Eden tried to defend his actions. His voice trembled slightly as he said, Our only aim was peace, peace through strength. The opposition benches erupted in laughter. He looked out over the chamber, once the heart of empire, and saw only disapproval. The old authority was gone. 2 months later, broken and ill, he resigned. The doctor's report cited overwork and ill health. History would later offer another diagnosis: the exhaustion of empire. In Paris, the mood was no better. Guy Mollet, the French Prime Minister, faced outrage at home. His people questioned why their sons had been sent to die in a war that accomplished nothing. Within a year, he too would be gone. And in Washington, Eisenhower smiled grimly. Without firing a shot, America had demonstrated what the old empires could not: the ability to shape the new world through economic and political power. The balance of global authority had shifted, quietly but permanently. The British ultimatum, once meant to reassert dominance, had instead marked its end. It was the last roar of an empire that no longer understood the world it lived in. In Cairo, meanwhile, Nasser emerged from the wreckage stronger than ever. Though his army had been defeated in the field, his defiance had made him a hero across the Arab world. Crowds hailed him as the man who stood up to the West and survived. From the ashes of the canal, a new symbol rose, not of empire, but of independence. And so, while London mourned its illusions and Paris its pride, Cairo celebrated the birth of something larger. The moment the Middle East stopped being someone else's stage and began writing its own script, the ultimatum had been Britain's final command to the world. The silence that followed was history's reply. Chapter 9. The French Return. Paris in 1956 was a city between two worlds. In the cafes of Saint-Germain, the philosophers spoke of freedom and the future, of Europe reborn after the ruins of war. But in the halls of government, the conversations were far darker: whispers of rebellion, of colonies burning, of an empire collapsing one province at a time. France had emerged from the Second World War, both liberated and haunted. It had survived occupation, humiliation, and resistance. Yet, as the ashes settled, it tried to reclaim its place among the great powers, to forget that the world had changed while it had been under siege. It was an impossible dream. By the mid-1952s, the French Empire was bleeding from all sides. In Indochina, its armies had already suffered a crushing defeat at Dien Bien Phu in 1954, a battle that ended nearly a century of French colonial presence in Asia. The shock of that loss still echoed through the corridors of Paris, a wound that refused to heal. Now, another fire raged closer to home: Algeria. For France, Algeria was not merely a colony. It was considered part of France itself, 3 departments across the Mediterranean. But to the Algerians who rose in rebellion, it was a prison of foreign rule. Their revolution, led by the PREJ, National Liberation Front, FLN, was fierce and unyielding. And at the heart of their inspiration stood one man, Gamal Abdel Nasser. To the French government, Nasser was more than just the president of Egypt. He was the voice behind every colonial uprising. His speeches, broadcast over Radio Cairo, reached deep into North Africa, calling for Arab unity and independence. The Algerian rebels adored him, quoting his words as if they were scripture. For Guy Mollet, the French Prime Minister, and his Foreign Minister Christian Pinot, Nasser had become the face of everything they feared: the embodiment of a world turning against them. Mollet was a socialist by title, but a colonialist by instinct. He believed France's mission was to civilize, to lead. Yet even he could not ignore the tide of history. Every act of repression in Algeria only seemed to strengthen the rebels' resolve. Every victory turned hollow. By the time Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, Mollet's patience had run out. "This man," he said to Pinot, "has declared war on France, even if he does not fire a single bullet." To him, the Suez Crisis was not about oil or trade. It was about Algeria. It was about silencing the voice that fueled rebellion. When Britain approached France with talk of reclaiming order in the Middle East, Mollet saw more than strategy. He saw revenge. At first, the French public was divided. Some saw Nasser's move as bold, the act of a man freeing his nation from colonial chains. But others, especially among the political elite, saw humiliation. For nearly a century, France had shared control of the canal, its engineers and investors intertwined with its lifeblood. Now, with one speech, Egypt had erased them. France's pride fragile since Indochina cracked once more. So when the opportunity came to join Britain and Israel in a secret pact, France did not hesitate. To them, this was their return, their chance to show the world that France still possessed the will and the might to shape events beyond its borders. In the quiet villa at Sèvres, where the alliance was forged, the French delegation had been the most eager. They offered Israel air cover, equipment, and intelligence. They saw in Israel's young army a mirror of their own lost vigor, disciplined, daring, unburdened by guilt. Together, Pinault told the Israeli representatives, "We will humble him. We will show that the sun of Europe still rises over the East." It was a comforting illusion, and one they clung to desperately. When the war began, the French press framed it as a mission of justice. Order must be restored in the Canal Zone, the headlines read. But behind the official language lay a different hunger, the desire to prove that France could still command, still punish, still matter. In the military headquarters at Vincennes, generals spoke with excitement they hadn't felt since the war. The French Air Force, modern and eager, joined the operation with precision. From their bases in Cyprus and Crete, they launched raids across Egypt, striking radar stations, oil depots, and rail lines. To the pilots, it felt like redemption, the chance to fly again under the banner of victory. But as the days passed, redemption began to fade into doubt. The reports from the front grew grim. Port Said was in ruins. Civilians lay wounded in the streets. The peacekeeping mission looked increasingly like an invasion. In Algiers, meanwhile, Nasser's name became a chant on every wall. The rebels, far from intimidated, felt emboldened. They painted slogans in Arabic, "Nasser lives, empire dies." It was a cruel irony. The very war meant to silence him had made him louder than ever. When the United States and the Soviet Union turned against the invasion, France's position became untenable. Eisenhower's condemnation cut deep. America was supposed to be an ally, yet Mollet could not afford to alienate. Washington, France's economy was too fragile, its international standing too thin. On November 6th, under pressure from every direction, the ceasefire was signed. In Paris, the news was met with confusion. The government called it a pause, a strategic withdrawal. But everyone knew the truth. The war was lost, not militarily, but morally. The French soldiers who returned from Egypt found no parades waiting for them. Their faces, sunburned and weary, passed through silent crowds. The newspapers spoke no longer of glory, but of scandal. "What have we gained?" one headline asked. No one could answer. In the assembly, opposition leaders accused the government of deceit. "You have shamed the republic," they shouted. "You have fought for nothing but pride." Mollet sat still, his eyes fixed on the papers before him. He no longer argued. He simply whispered to Pinault, "Perhaps it is not Nasser who has beaten us, but time itself." In the months that followed, the fallout deepened. France's role in NATO grew uncertain. Relations with the Arab world collapsed. The war in Algeria intensified, now fought with even greater fury. The Suez adventure, meant to strengthen France, had instead revealed her weakness, her dependence on allies, her isolation in a changing world. Yet from that humiliation came something unexpected. A generation of French leaders, disillusioned by dependence on Britain and America, began to dream of a new course, a France that would never again fight another man's war. Among them was a name that had once been exiled to silence, Charles de Gaulle. 2 years later, he would return to power, ending the Fourth Republic and founding the Fifth. Under his leadership, France would leave the shadow of empire behind and seek greatness not through colonies, but through independence. But in 1956, none of that was yet clear. All that remained was the ache of defeat, the sense of something old slipping away. As the Manners, winter rain fell over Paris, Guy Mollet looked out his window at the Seine. The water moved slowly, steadily, reflecting the dim lights of the city. It reminded him of the canal, the one they had tried and failed to reclaim. Once, the rivers of empire had carried the power of nations across oceans. Now, they carried only memory. The French return to Suez had been meant as a resurrection. Instead, it became a requiem, the final act of an empire that could not accept its own reflection. And somewhere in Cairo, as the smoke cleared and the crowds cheered Nasser's name, the echoes of that requiem drifted across the sea, the soft, fading lullaby of a world that had ended without even realizing it. Chapter 10. Fire over Port. Said the morning light came softly over the harbor, painting the smoke in shades of gold and gray. For a moment, the world looked peaceful, as if the war had stopped to catch its breath. But beneath that stillness, Port Said was burning. The smell of salt and fire hung in the air. Rubble crunched underfoot. The muezzin's call to prayer echoed faintly through the haze, rising over the distant rumble of tanks and the crackle of flames. The city, once a proud gateway to the Suez Canal, now stood scarred and broken, its streets a maze of shattered glass and twisted steel. British and French troops had taken the northern districts inch by inch through a storm of gunfire and debris. The Egyptian defenders, soldiers, police, and volunteers had refused to surrender, fighting from doorways, from rooftops, from behind the remains of buses overturned into barricades. War had come to Port Said like a thief in the night, and by dawn, it had stolen everything. In a narrow alley, Corporal Peter Hall, a 24-year-old Marine from Liverpool, crouched behind a wall. His hands trembled as he reloaded his rifle. "Ceasefire's supposed to come soon," his sergeant muttered beside him. Hall nodded, though he barely heard. His ears rang from the bombardment. When he peered around the corner, he saw an old Egyptian man standing in the doorway of a half-collapsed shop, waving a white cloth, perhaps a shirt. The man's face was lined with exhaustion. His lips moved, but Hall couldn't hear the words. He lowered his rifle. For a moment, the two men simply looked at one another through the haze. Enemies, perhaps, but also survivors. Then, a shell screamed overhead, striking a building down the street, and the old man vanished in the smoke. War had no room for recognition. Above the city, the sky pulsed with the thunder of engines. British Seahawks and French Corsairs circled like vultures, dropping leaflets that fluttered uselessly among the ashes. "Lay down your arms," they said in Arabic and French. Few could read them, and fewer still cared. At the docks, the French paratroopers moved with mechanical precision. They had secured the Raswa Bridge and the southern waterworks, cutting off the Egyptian escape routes. The air was thick with heat and dust. The clang of metal boots echoed through the narrow lanes, mingled with the cries of civilians searching for loved ones. For the paratroopers, the mission was clear: take the city, control the canal. But in the faces of the civilians, they saw something that orders could not explain: defiance. Women stood in the doorways of their ruined homes, staring at the soldiers with eyes that burned hotter than the fires. Children carried buckets of water to the wounded. Old men muttered prayers over the bodies in the street. It was not the resistance of an army, it was the resistance of memory. At Allied headquarters, anchored offshore aboard the carrier Theseus, the radio crackled with contradictions. Reports from London: ceasefire imminent. Reports from the front: fierce resistance continues. Reports from Washington: withdraw immediately or face economic collapse. The admirals stood around a table, maps spread wide, hands pressed to their temples. The chain of command, once so precise, had become a tangle of confusion. The war was being fought faster than it could be ended. One officer looked up from the radio log. "They're saying the Americans might cut off our oil supply within a week," he said. Another replied quietly, "Then all of this." will have been for nothing. On the ground, for the men in the streets, the concept of politics meant nothing. The Royal Marines had pushed as far as Al-Cap, just north of Alcantara, before the ceasefire was expected to take hold. The path had been brutal sniper fire from hidden windows, traps wired beneath rubble, the sudden bursts of gunfire that came from nowhere and everywhere at once. Each block conquered felt less like victory and more like exhaustion. In one courtyard, British medics tended to the wounded Egyptian and British alike. The cries of pain and the murmured prayers were indistinguishable. A nurse, wiping the sweat from her brow, whispered, "It's always the same, isn't it? No matter whose side you're on." In Cairo, Gamal Abdel Nasser sat in his office, surrounded by smoke and papers. The phone lines buzzed with reports: chaos in Port Said, demands from the United Nations, threats from the Soviets, and support from across the Arab world. His military was battered, his country bleeding, but his will had not broken. He turned to one of his advisors. "They thought they could make us bow," he said, his voice calm. "But the whole world is watching now. They have become the villains in their own story." When news of civilian casualties reached him, Nasser's eyes darkened. "Every life lost will be remembered," he said. "Every drop of blood is another stone in the monument of our independence." He was right. In the streets of Cairo, crowds chanted his name. Across Damascus, Baghdad, and Algiers, his portrait appeared on walls. The man who had been a symbol of defiance now became a legend. Back in Port Said, as the sun began to fall, the shadows grew long over the canal. Fires burned in the harbor, their reflections dancing in the black water. French soldiers stood at the docks, staring at the glow of the burning ships. Some lit cigarettes, their faces illuminated for a moment before vanishing into the smoke. Others simply watched, silent. One, a young lieutenant from Marseille, took out a small notebook and wrote, "We came to bring order, but all I see is ash." He closed the book and never wrote again. By the evening of November 6th, the ceasefire was confirmed. The order came through radios, terse and final. All operations to halt at midnight. The message spread through the ranks like a whisper. For some, it was a relief, the end of chaos. For others, it was a wound, the ending of purpose. At precisely 12 a.m., the guns fell silent. The night returned to stillness. The only sound was the crackling of fire and the distant barking of dogs. British Marines, French paratroopers, and Egyptian defenders all paused, as if unsure what came next. In the dim light of a ruined church, Corporal Hall sat against a wall, staring at the sky. He could still hear the echo of explosions in his mind, like waves breaking against the shore. He wondered if the old man from the doorway had survived. He would never know. The next morning, the United Nations flags appeared on the horizon, white and blue, fluttering gently above the wreckage. Peacekeepers began to land soldiers from nations that had not fired a single shot in the war. Their arrival felt surreal, almost sacred. After the noise of battle, children gathered to watch them disembark. A few even smiled. The United Nations Emergency Force, formed in the chaos of the Suez Crisis, was something new, a global promise that war could no longer be left to empires alone. The blue helmets became a symbol of a different kind of power, collective, cautious, imperfect, but human. For Egypt, it was a breath of dignity restored. For the British and French, it was the beginning of retreat. Within weeks, the Allied forces began to withdraw. The ships that had once carried ambition now carried disillusionment. The flags came down quietly, without ceremony. The sea reclaimed its silence. In the months that followed, Port Said rebuilt itself slowly. The canals reopened, the markets returned, and children played again in the streets that had once echoed with gunfire. But scars remained not only on the walls, but in the memories of those who had lived through those 9 terrible days. To some, the war was a victory of spirit. To others, a defeat disguised as pride. But to history, it was something larger, a transition, the moment when the world changed hands. The Suez Crisis had shown that the age of empires was over, not with treaties or revolutions, but with the sight of young men fighting in a foreign city that no longer wanted them. And as the smoke faded from Port Said, the ghosts of the past drifted quietly over the canal, whispering the same truth to anyone who would listen. Power, once taken for granted, is never eternal. The fire had burned brightly, but it was the silence that endured. Chapter 11. The Global Outcry. The guns had fallen silent in Port Said, but the echoes of war traveled farther than any bullet ever could. They rippled across oceans, through newspapers and radio waves, through parliaments and presidencies, reaching every corner of a world that was watching, judging, and deciding what kind of future it wanted. For the first time in modern memory, the old empires were not just losing battles, they were losing permission. In Washington, D.C., the Suez Crisis struck like a betrayal. President Dwight D. Eisenhower sat in the Oval Office, his jaw tight as he read the latest cable from London. Britain and France, his closest allies, had launched a full-scale invasion of Egypt without warning or consultation. Worse, they had done so in secret collaboration with Israel under the pretense of peacekeeping. To Eisenhower, a soldier who had commanded Allied armies in the Second World War, this was not strategy. It was deceit. They lied to us, he said flatly to Secretary of State John Foster Dulles, tossing the report onto his desk. They've lost their minds. It's 1,956, not 1,856. Eisenhower had built his presidency on stability, on the promise that after 2 global wars, peace could be maintained through reason, restraint, and American leadership. But the Suez invasion had torn that illusion apart. It was colonial arrogance, reborn in the nuclear age, reckless, unnecessary, and catastrophic for the West's image. And it could not have come at a worse time. Across Eastern Europe, Soviet tanks were crushing the Hungarian Revolution, killing thousands in the streets of Budapest. The United States had condemned the Soviet invasion as barbaric an assault on freedom. But now, as British and French planes bombed Egyptian cities, Washington's moral authority was collapsing. How can we denounce Moscow? Eisenhower asked bitterly, while our own allies behaved the same way. He ordered immediate action not with guns, but with economics. The U.S. would deny Britain emergency financial aid unless it withdrew. It was a ruthless move, but Eisenhower believed it was the only way to prevent global chaos. Pull back, he told the British ambassador. Pull back, or we let your economy sink. Behind those calm words lay a quiet revolution. The United States, once the junior partner of empire, had now become its master. In New York, the United Nations General Assembly convened an emergency session. The hall, vast and echoing, vibrated with anger. Delegates from Asia, Africa, and the Middle East stood one after another to condemn the invasion. The Indian representative, his voice steady and fierce, declared, "This is not a conflict between nations. It is the struggle of the old world against the new, of domination against freedom." The Arab delegates, some trembling with emotion, accused the West of hypocrisy. "You speak of democracy," one shouted, "but you bring only bombs." At the front of the chamber, the Egyptian ambassador, Omar Lutfi, stood tall, his eyes tired but proud. "Egypt will never bow to aggression," he said. "Our land is ours, our canal is ours, and the age of empires is dead." When he finished, the hall erupted in applause, not polite, but thunderous, raw, cathartic. It was more than sympathy for Egypt. It was the sound of a century's worth of resentment breaking free. The British and French delegations sat motionless, surrounded by a sea of condemnation. For the first time, their words carried no weight. The power they once commanded with flags and fleets now evaporated in the air, replaced by the quiet authority of nations they had once ruled. Meanwhile, in Moscow, Nikita Khrushchev watched events unfold with a predator's grin. For the Soviet Union, Suez was a gift wrapped in chaos. As the world condemned the Western powers, Moscow stood poised as the supposed defender of the oppressed. Khrushchev denounced the imperialist invasion and threatened rocket retaliation if the aggression did not cease. He sent cables to Cairo, offering arms, aid, and political support. Whether or not the Soviets could actually strike, London or Paris mattered little. The fear alone was enough. The message was clear. The Cold War had reached the Middle East. While Soviet tanks rolled through Budapest, Soviet words now soared over Cairo like banners of liberation. It was a masterstroke of propaganda, one that would reshape alliances for decades. Eisenhower recognized the danger immediately. "We're losing the third world," he said. "If we don't stop this, Nasser becomes a hero, and Moscow becomes his friend." And so, America reluctantly, ironically found itself defending the very man its allies had tried to destroy. In London, the outcry was more personal. The British people had followed the war through radio and newspapers. At first, many believed the official line that their nation was restoring peace, protecting trade, and keeping order in a volatile region. But as reports of civilian casualties and international condemnation poured in, belief turned to disbelief, then anger. Protests filled Trafalgar Square. Students, veterans, and workers marched side by side, carrying signs that read, "No war for oil," and "Empire is over." For the first time in living memory, ordinary Britons openly questioned not just their government, but the very idea of empire. One elderly veteran, interviewed by the BBC, said softly, "I fought for this country against tyranny. I didn't think we'd become it." Within Parliament, the opposition leader Hugh Gaitskell called the invasion a disaster of our own making. Even members of Eden's own party whispered that he had lost his mind. By the end of November, the pressure was unbearable. The United States had frozen British financial aid. The United Nations demanded withdrawal, and the streets of London demanded answers. It was not the Egyptian army that defeated Britain. It was the realization that the world no longer needed its permission. In Paris, the outrage came more quietly, but it cut just as deep. France had joined the invasion to reclaim pride lost in Indochina and Algeria. Instead, it found itself humiliated once again. As the ceasefire took effect, the French press turned against the government. "A war without victory, a victory without meaning," wrote one columnist. In Algiers, the rebels rejoiced. Radio Cairo broadcast their celebrations across North Africa. "France cannot even hold a canal," they said. "How can it hold a continent?" To the colonial soldiers in the desert, the words were daggers. And then there was Cairo, the city that had become the center of the world's attention. In the cafes along the Nile, crowds gathered around radios, listening to reports of ceasefires and condemnations. The city buzzed with pride, relief, and disbelief. Against three of the most powerful militaries on earth, Egypt had survived, not because it had won on the battlefield, but because it had won in the court of history. When Gamal Abdel Nasser appeared on state radio, his voice carried across the nation like thunder. "They came to break us, but they have broken themselves. The canal is ours, our destiny is ours, and the Arab world shall never again bow its head." The people roared in the streets. To them, Nasser was no longer just a leader. He was the embodiment of Arab defiance, a man who had turned humiliation into triumph. Across the Middle East, something profound began to shift. Young men in Damascus, Baghdad, and Amman painted Nasser's face on walls. Students chanted his name in universities from Cairo to Casablanca. The message was clear. Colonial rule was over, and those who still clung to it were relics. The world had changed, not through diplomacy, not through treaties, but through humiliation. The Suez Crisis had revealed a truth that could no longer be denied. Power no longer belonged to the few nations that claimed to shape the world. It belonged to the world itself. In the months that followed, the United Nations Emergency Force, the first of its kind, took up positions along the Sinai, ensuring peace through collective will. It was an imperfect experiment, but a revolutionary one. For the first time, humanity was trying to police itself, not through empires, but through unity. For Britain and France, it was the end of an era. For the United States and the Soviet Union, it was the beginning of theirs. And for Egypt, for the Arab world, it was the dawn of something new. Dignity reclaimed, destiny rewritten. The Suez Crisis lasted just 9 days, but its consequences would echo for decades. It realigned the balance of global power, redrew alliances, and exposed the myths of moral empire. In the calm that followed, history exhaled, and the world, quietly, began to move on. But somewhere in that silence, if one listens closely, the voices remain the voices of London's protests, of Cairo's celebrations, of Washington's frustration, of soldiers on both sides staring at the smoke rising from the canal, all asking the same question, in different tongues and tones. What does it mean to be powerful when the world no longer obeys? The answer, as always, came not in speeches or weapons but in silence. The silence of ships drifting through reopened waters. The silence of leaders signing treaties they no longer believed in. The silence of an empire falling asleep, and another awakening in its place. Chapter 12. The United Nations steps in. The desert was finally quiet. The sound of engines, the thunder of bombs, the cries of soldiers and civilians, all had faded into the distance. Only the wind remained, whispering across dunes littered with the remnants of war. The sky, once streaked with fire and smoke, had returned to a pale, indifferent blue. The Suez Canal lay still beneath it, scarred, silent, and sovereign once more. The war was over. Yet peace, as always, was another battle waiting to be fought. When the ceasefire came on November 6, 1956, it wasn't greeted with cheers. There was no parade, no victory anthem. It arrived like an exhale, a weary, cautious sigh shared by soldiers and civilians alike. Around the world, leaders exchanged telegrams, diplomats drafted statements, and families emerged from their homes wondering what the next morning would bring. For the first time, perhaps, the old empires had realized that the world no longer moved at their command. In New York, the United Nations General Assembly met under the cold glow of chandeliers, the air thick with fatigue. The Dodd speeches that had filled the chamber with outrage just days earlier now carried a quieter tone, one of exhaustion, perhaps even humility. Amid the tension and mistrust, a soft-spoken Swedish diplomat named Dag Hammarskjöld rose to speak. As Secretary General of the UN, he had watched the Suez Crisis unfold like a storm breaking over everything the organization was meant to prevent. He had seen the world's most powerful nations act as if the rules didn't apply to them. But Hammarskjöld believed in something fragile and revolutionary, that peace was not the absence of war, but the presence of understanding. He proposed an idea that had never been tried before: a neutral force, composed of soldiers from nations with no stake in the conflict, to step into Egypt not as occupiers, but as guardians of calm. They would not conquer, they would not dictate. They would simply stand a living wall between those who had fought and the peace that now struggled to survive. To many in the room, the idea sounded naive. How could unarmed diplomacy succeed where armies had failed? But the world had just seen what power could destroy. Perhaps it was time to see what patience could protect. The motion passed, and in that moment, something new was born, the first true peacekeeping mission in human history. The United Nations Emergency Force, or UNF, would wear light blue helmets, the color of the sky, as a promise that they belonged not to any nation, but to all. Soldiers from Canada, Norway, Denmark, India, and Colombia would form the heart of this unprecedented army of peace. They would go not to fight, but to stand between the fighters to prove that stability could come not from empire, but from empathy. When the first peacekeepers arrived in Egypt later that month, the people of Port Said watched in cautious disbelief. For weeks, they had seen only foreign uniforms: British, French, Israeli soldiers who claimed to bring peace, but came instead with fire. Yet these men, who disembarked from the ships, were different. They moved calmly, methodically, unarmed except for their helmets and a quiet sense of purpose. Children waved from alleyways. Mothers peeked from shattered windows. The soldiers smiled back, unsure if they were welcome, but certain they were needed. One Egyptian man later said, "They came not as conquerors, but as witnesses." And that was exactly what they were. They brought medicine, food, and order to streets that had known only fear. They cleared the rubble, carried the wounded, and buried the dead. Their uniforms bore no flags, only a small emblem of the United Nations, the world encircled by olive branches. For a brief and beautiful moment, the world seemed to be guarding itself. In Cairo, President Nasser received the UN representatives with measured respect. He did not forget that Egypt's sovereignty had been violated, nor that these new arrivals still represented an international system dominated by powers who had once tried to destroy him. But Hammarskjöld's sincerity impressed him. The two men met in private, one a revolutionary soldier, the other a philosopher of peace. "Egypt welcomes peace," Nasser said, "but it must be Egyptian peace, not imposed from abroad." Hammarskjöld nodded. "Then, let us make peace that belongs to everyone." That handshake, silent and dignified, marked the start of a new chapter in diplomacy. Meanwhile, the armies that had invaded Egypt began their withdrawal. British convoys moved slowly through the sand, their engines groaning under the desert heat. French units packed up their equipment, boarding ships with the heavy stillness of men who knew they had lost more than a battle. Israeli troops, proud yet uneasy, were ordered to retreat under American pressure. The soldiers looked back across the dunes toward the canal, uncertain if their victories meant anything at all. By December, the Union Jack and the tricolor were lowered from Fek to Gay, Egyptian soil. The old flags of empire fluttered one last time in the hot wind before disappearing beyond the horizon. Watching from the harbor, Egyptian civilians stood in silence, not celebrating, not jeering, but simply witnessing the end of something vast and tired. Along the banks of the canal, the blue helmets stood watch, their calm figures reflected in the water like faint ghosts of a new kind of power without domination. For the United Nations, this fragile success was proof that cooperation could replace conquest. Hammarskjöld, ever humble, refused to call it a victory. "Peace," he said, "is a daily work never finished, always fragile." He spent his nights reading field reports, ensuring that the peacekeepers remained neutral and that Egypt's sovereignty was respected. To him, the Suez mission was not a triumph to be remembered, but a foundation to be built upon. The idea that had begun here, the idea that the world could protect itself through collective action, would shape the next half-century of diplomacy. In the months that followed, the Suez Canal came back to life. Egyptian engineers worked tirelessly to clear the sunken ships and reopen the vital artery of world trade. The waterway, once a symbol of colonial dominance, now became a symbol of independence. Ships began to pass through again, their wakes rippling softly under the desert. Sunday, on the shore, workers sang folk songs as they hauled debris from the water. The rhythm of their labor was slow but steady, like the heartbeat of a nation reclaiming itself. President Nasser, now the unchallenged hero of the Arab world, visited the canal in early 1957. Standing on the deck of a tugboat, he looked out at the ships gliding past, each one a silent acknowledgement of his defiance. He turned to his ministers and said quietly, "The canal is Egypt's, but it belongs to the world. We will never again be ruled through it." Those words carried far beyond the water, across Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, to every nation that had once bowed to foreign rule. In New York, diplomats applauded the outcome. Newspapers hailed Hammarskjöld's innovation as a turning point for civilization, proof that the pen could, for once, hold its own against the sword. Lester Pearson, the Canadian diplomat who had helped craft the idea, called it a new chapter in the history of human decency. Yet beneath the optimism, there was an understanding that peacekeeping was not perfection. It was a promise, and promises, like peace, could be broken. One evening, as the sun set over the Sinai dunes, a young Canadian peacekeeper stood by the canal. He watched the sky turn gold, then violet, then deep blue, the same blue as his helmet. In the distance, The faint hum of a cargo ship drifted across the water. He thought of the men who had died here. Egyptians, Israelis, British, French, all convinced they were fighting for honor, all swallowed by the same indifferent desert. He realized that the line between victory and loss was thinner than sand. As night fell, he removed his helmet and dipped his hand into the water. It was cool and silent, carrying reflections of stars. Somewhere far away, politicians argued about treaties and resolutions. But here, in the quiet heart of Egypt, the world itself seemed to rest. For that moment, peace existed not as a treaty or a headline, but as something human and fleeting. The wind sighed over the dunes, and the canal, once again open to the world, shimmered like a mirror. It reflected not empires, but possibility. And in that reflection, the century turned a page. Chapter 13. The Rise of Nasser. The dust of war had barely settled over the Nile when a new kind of storm began to form, not of tanks or airplanes, but of words, songs, and hope. Egypt, wounded and weary, found itself staring at a miracle. It had survived. It had faced three of the world's most powerful militaries, Britain, France, and Israel, and remained standing. In the streets of Cairo, that simple fact became legend. At the heart of it stood Gamal Abdel Nasser, a man who had risen from the son of a postal clerk to the most recognizable face in the Arab world. For years, he had been mocked by Western diplomats as the colonel who dreamed too big, a nationalist playing empire in a world of superpowers. But now, after Suez, he no longer needed to demand respect. The world was already listening. In the weeks after the ceasefire, Cairo was transformed. The city pulsed with music and celebration. Radio Cairo, which had once been drowned out by British propaganda, now blared victory songs from every corner of the city. Men danced in the streets, women waved flags from balconies, and through it all, one name echoed like a heartbeat: Nasser, Nasser, Nasser. He had not won the war by conquest. Egypt's army had retreated in the Sinai, its cities bombed, its skies dominated by foreign planes. But he had won something far greater, the moral victory. He had turned survival itself into triumph, humiliation into defiance, and Egypt's isolation into leadership. In the Arab world, where generations had lived under the shadow of colonial rule that mattered more than territory, for the first time, the people of the region saw that the West could be defied and still be forced to listen. Across Damascus, Baghdad, and Amman, young Arabs pinned his portrait on their walls. In the cafes of Beirut, students quoted his speeches like scripture. In Algeria, fighting for independence, rebels carried his image into the mountains. To them, Nasser was not just the leader of Egypt. He was the voice of every colonized soul still waiting to breathe freely. He became a symbol of something larger than himself: Pan-Arabism, the dream of unity, pride, and self-determination for all Arab nations. Nasser understood the power of this dream. He was not a poet, yet his speeches had tints of it. Rhythm, not a philosopher, yet his words carried prophecy. He spoke in the language of ordinary people, not the sterile tones of diplomats, but the fire of a man who had seen his country humiliated and vowed never again. "We stood alone," he told the nation in one of his most famous broadcasts. But the Arab world stood with us. The canal was not just a waterway, it was our dignity, and dignity cannot be stolen. The crowd's response was thunderous. Millions listened in tears, not because the speech was grand, but because it was honest. Western capitals, however, listened with unease. In London and Paris, diplomats saw in Nasser a new kind of enemy, not a general commanding armies, but a leader commanding hearts. The press called him the voice of the East, the Pharaoh of Cairo, even the Arab Napoleon. He shrugged at the labels. He had no intention of conquering by war. His conquest was through pride, through belief. Nasser's charisma wasn't calculated, it was instinctive. He spoke not from arrogance, but from a deep conviction that the Arab world had for too long been told what it was allowed to be. His own life reflected that struggle. Born in Alexandria in 1918, raised in a modest family, he had joined the army not for glory, but for dignity. During the 1948 war against Israel, he had seen firsthand the corruption and incompetence of Egypt's monarchy, officers dying in the desert because their leaders cared more for palaces than soldiers. That betrayal shaped him. It hardened his ideals into purpose. By 1952, when he led the free officers in overthrowing King Farouk, Nasser's revolution wasn't about ideology. It was about reclaiming Egypt's soul. But Suez gave that revolution meaning. For the first time, the world saw that Egypt, and by extension, the Arab world, could stand on its own, and Nasser knew how to use that momentum. He launched social reforms, nationalized industries, and began massive infrastructure projects. Most famously, he vowed to complete the Aswan High Dam, the colossal project that Britain and America had refused to fund. When Western financing was withdrawn, Nasser simply turned to the Soviet Union, signing an agreement that shocked the world. Moscow supplied engineers, funds, and equipment. Egypt, once a pawn in imperial politics, now played both sides of the Cold War for its own advantage. But Nasser was no puppet. He distrusted both Washington and Moscow, seeing in their rivalry another form of domination. "We will not trade one master for another," he said. "We belong to neither camp. We belong to ourselves." That stance of non-alignment would inspire dozens of new nations emerging from colonial rule in Asia and Africa. At the Bandung Conference in 1955 and later at Belgrade, leaders like Nehru, Tito, and Sukarno joined Nasser in building a movement of independence, one that refused to bow to either superpower. In those years after Suez, Nasser's Egypt became more than a nation. It became an idea. The Nile Valley pulsed with a strange, magnetic energy, a blend of optimism and destiny. Western observers called it the Nasser effect. Journalists arrived in Cairo to witness what one American newspaper called the birth of the New East. But beneath the triumph, Nasser carried a burden that few could see. The weight of expectation was immense. He was not just leading Egypt, he was leading an entire world hungry for justice. Every success raised him higher. Every setback threatened to undo everything. In private, those close to him described a man who rarely slept, who paced at night along the balcony of the presidential palace, staring at the lights of Cairo below. Sometimes he would pause and ask quietly, "Have we gone too fast? Can one man carry a dream this heavy?" But by morning, the doubts vanished. He would put on his military jacket, step before the cameras, and speak again with the calm confidence that had made him immortal in the eyes of millions. The West continued to underestimate him. British tabloids called him a dictator. French papers accused him of spreading communism. Israeli officials labeled him a threat to survival. Yet behind every accusation lay an uncomfortable truth. Nasser was not just an opponent, he was a mirror. He reflected back to the world its own fears that power built on control could no longer survive in an age of awakening. By 1958, his influence reached its peak. Egypt and Syria united to form the United Arab Republic, a bold experiment in Arab unity. Though the union would not last, the message it carried did. The dream of a single Arab destiny, free from foreign rule. In the eyes of his people, Nasser was no longer just a president. He was Al-Zaim, the leader, the embodiment of Arab pride, the voice that had turned shame into song. Years later, when the historian Arnold Toynbee was asked what the Suez Crisis truly meant, he replied, "It was the end of Europe's domination and the beginning of Nasser's century." And though that century would be short, and though the tides of history would one day turn against him, in those radiant years after Suez, Nasser was untouchable, a man who had shown that defiance could be stronger than armies, and that belief could be louder than bombs. On quiet evenings, he would sometimes drive to the Nile alone, sit on its bank, and watch the water flow. The river, he once told a journalist, has seen pharaohs rise and fall, but it still flows. Perhaps nations are like rivers. You can dam them, divert them, even poison them, but they will always find their way. In 1956, Nasser had found Egypt's way, and in doing so, he had found the voice of a world that refused to be silent any longer. Chapter 14. The Fall of Empires. In the winter of 1956, as the last British and French troops withdrew from Egyptian soil, two of the greatest empires the world had ever known began to crumble, not with explosions or revolutions, but with silence. For centuries, they had ruled half the earth. Their flags had flown over deserts and jungles, from Hong Kong to Dakar, from Bombay to Beirut. They had carved trade routes, toppled dynasties, and believed with unshakable certainty that the world existed to be guided by their hand. But in that cold gray December, as ships carrying weary soldiers cut through the Mediterranean, something within them broke forever. The Suez Crisis was not merely a failed war. It was an ending, the final chapter in the story of empire. For Britain and France, it was the moment they realized that power no longer flowed from their ports or their cannons, but from forces they could neither control nor fully understand. In London, Prime Minister Anthony Eden sat in his office at 10 Downing Street, his health failing, his reputation shattered. He had once been the golden boy of British diplomacy, suave, articulate, seen as the natural successor to Churchill. But the Suez debacle had undone everything. Once he had believed that Britain could still act as the world's moral compass, guiding others with firm but benevolent authority. Now, his own people called him a liar. The Americans had turned against him, and the pound, the mighty currency of empire, was collapsing under financial pressure. At night, Eden would stare at the map hanging on his wall, the one showing the British Empire in red. So much of the world still seemed covered by it, and yet it felt meaningless now, like the fading markings of a forgotten age. "The empire is over," one of his aides whispered to him. "We just haven't admitted it yet." He resigned 2 months later. Britain had won wars, survived bombings, and defied tyranny, but Suez had left it something it had never been before: small. Across the Channel, France faced its own reckoning. Prime Minister Guy Mollet, who had championed the war with fiery conviction, now faced ridicule and outrage. The Suez invasion had been meant to restore pride after the humiliation of Indochina and the chaos of Algeria. Instead, it had deepened the wound. In cafes across Paris, the word Suez became shorthand for futility. "We fought for honor," one veteran said, but came home with shame. French newspapers filled with questions no one could answer. What are we fighting for? What are we still trying to prove? The truth was painful. France had been fighting to hold on to a world that no longer existed. In the shadows of its empire, in Hanoi, in Algiers, in Dakar, the people it once ruled were writing their own destinies. The illusion of control was gone. At the Élysée Palace, Mollet admitted privately, "We have lost something more than a canal. We have lost our reflection." And indeed, Suez had held a mirror to both nations, one that showed not their greatness, but their exhaustion. Britain, once the merchant of the world, now found itself dependent on America's approval to act. France, once the symbol of civilization, now stood accused of hypocrisy and colonial cruelty. The white man's burden, that old justification for empire, had become a weight they could no longer carry. The world, meanwhile, was moving on without them. In Asia and Africa, nations were breaking free: Ghana, Tunisia, Morocco, Sudan, all declaring independence within a few short years. What Suez had proved was that even the mightiest empires could no longer stop the tide. The Cold War had created a new kind of empire. One fought not with armies, but with influence, ideology, and fear. The future belonged to Washington and Moscow, not London or Paris. The old European order had finally yielded to the age of superpowers. For the British people, this realization came slowly, almost tenderly. The war had left them weary, the ration books and bomb shelters of the 1,940 seconds still fresh in memory. But after Suez, a deeper fatigue set in, the fatigue of relevance slipping away. The newspapers spoke of decline, yet few understood what it meant to live through it. It wasn't the collapse of buildings or governments, but something quieter, a loss of certainty, of purpose, of identity. Still, there was dignity in that decline. In the decades that followed, Britain turned inward, rebuilding its economy, creating the National Health Service, and slowly learning to live without empire. It would reinvent itself as a trading nation, a cultural powerhouse, a kingdom no longer ruling others, but rediscovering itself. France, meanwhile, chose rebellion over resignation. Out of the ashes of Suez rose a man who refused to accept defeat, Charles de Gaulle. He saw in the crisis not an end, but an opportunity to reshape France's destiny. In 1958, he returned to power, founding the Fifth Republic and declaring that France would chart its own course, independent from both East and West. France, he said, is herself again. Under de Gaulle, France withdrew from NATO's military command, pursued its own nuclear program, and built a new vision of grandeur not through colonies, but through autonomy. Suez had taught him that following others led only to humiliation. From then on, France would walk alone. Yet, even as leaders rebuilt, the ghosts of empire lingered. In Algeria, France fought a brutal war of independence, unwilling to let go of the land it still called its own. The conflict would last 8 years, claiming hundreds of thousands of lives. In Kenya, Cyprus, and Malaya, Britain faced insurgencies born of the same rebellion that Nasser had ignited. The end of empire was not clean. It was slow, painful, and drenched in the echoes of its past. And yet, through all this loss, something profound was happening. For the first time, Europe began to look not outward, but inward, to build peace within, rather than dominance abroad. The dream of a European Union, conceived in the ruins of war, found new urgency after Suez. If they could no longer rule the world, perhaps they could unite it differently, not through empire, but through cooperation. In the years that followed, Europe's empires faded into textbooks. The red and blue lines on colonial maps dissolved into new nations, each with its own flag, its own anthem, its own voice. The world became noisier, more complex and freer. But the memory of empire never truly vanished. Even decades later, the Suez Crisis remained a lesson, whispered in the corridors of power, a warning that pride, when mixed with nostalgia, can destroy even the greatest of nations. In his final years, Anthony Eden rarely spoke of Suez. When asked about it by a journalist, he simply said, "I acted for Britain's interests. I only wish I had known sooner what they truly were." Guy Mollet, too, would later confess, "We thought we were defending civilization, but perhaps civilization was asking us to let go." On winter nights, when the Thames ran dark under London Bridge, and the Seine shimmered faintly beneath Parisian lights, the ghosts of the empire still walked, not as conquerors, but as memories. The world they had built, for all its cruelty and grandeur, had given way to another one, shaped not by sailors and soldiers, but by citizens and dreams. The Suez Canal still flowed quietly through the desert, indifferent to the flags that once claimed it. Ships passed through its waters carrying oil, grain, and the whispers of forgotten glory. Egypt had reclaimed her river, and the empires that once ruled, the waves had drifted gently into history. In the long sleep of empires, there is no roar, no explosion, only a sigh. The kind of sigh that begins when a nation finally realizes it is no longer the center of the world, but part of it. And somewhere in that sigh, between the silence of London and the dawn over Cairo, the 20th century truly began. Chapter 15. The Legacy of Life. Suez time has a way of softening the noise of war. Decades after the Suez Canal had fallen silent, the echoes of 1956 still rippled through the world, faint but unmistakable. The Suez Crisis was over in 9 days, yet its consequences stretched for generations. It was not a war of conquest or liberation, but of revelation, a moment when the 20th century paused, looked at itself, and saw the end of one age and the uncertain beginning of another. For Egypt, the legacy was immediate and profound. Though its army had suffered defeat, its spirit emerged unbroken. The canal, that narrow ribbon of blue slicing through the desert, became a symbol of pride and independence. Gamal Abdel Nasser stood at its banks as both victor and visionary. The man who had been mocked as reckless now became the architect of a new Middle East, one where colonial shadows were finally receding. He rebuilt the canal, reasserted Egypt's sovereignty, and turned his nation into a voice that could not be ignored. For the Arab world, Suez was more than history, it was rebirth. Across the region, from Damascus to Algiers, people spoke of Nasser not as a politician, but as a prophet of dignity. Arab nationalism surged with new fire. The young, the poor, and the disillusioned all looked to Cairo for guidance. For the first time in modern memory, the Arab world felt united not under a foreign power, but under an idea that destiny was once again in their own hands. But dreams, like revolutions, are fragile. Nasser's victory had awakened the hopes of millions and the fears of others. The West could not forget the humiliation of Suez, and neither could Israel. The stage was set for decades of mistrust, of rivalries that would twist the region into cycles of conflict and peace, defiance and despair. Still, for a brief and brilliant moment, the world believed in Egypt's light. Nasser became the voice of the non-aligned movement, standing alongside Nehru, Tito, and Sukarno, crafting a vision of independence for nations caught between Washington and Moscow. He spoke not of alliances but of balance. "We will not be tools," he said. "We will not choose between two masters. We choose ourselves." That spirit of defiance inspired countries across Africa and Asia. Leaders in Ghana, Indonesia, and Cuba drew lessons from Suez, that even the smallest nations could resist the pressures of empires. If they stood united, the canal had become a metaphor, a narrow passage through which old powers had tried to pass, only to find the tide turning against them. For Britain and France, Suez became a lesson carved in humility. The illusion of supremacy was shattered. No longer could they act without consequence. No longer could they summon armies at will. The empire had not simply declined, it had dissolved. Britain turned toward the United States for protection, entering a special relationship that would define its foreign policy for generations. France, meanwhile, turned inward, reinventing itself through Charles de Gaulle's vision of independence, a France that would never again follow blindly behind another nation. And beyond politics, Suez changed something deeper, the psychology of the West. The myth of invincibility was gone. The world had watched three of its oldest empires, humbled by a country they had once ruled. It was a reckoning not only of power, but of purpose. The age of command had given way to the age of cooperation and, perhaps, the age of doubt. The United States, too, learned from Suez. Eisenhower's decision to pressure Britain and France had preserved America's moral authority, but it had also placed the U.S. squarely at the center of global leadership. The American century, once a slogan, now became a reality. Yet, even as Washington celebrated its diplomatic triumph, it inherited the burdens once carried by the empires it had replaced. Within a decade, it would find itself entangled in Vietnam, confronting the same question Britain and France had failed to answer. How long can power sustain itself against the will of the people? The Soviet Union, for its part, gained new influence in the Middle East. By siding with Egypt and condemning Western aggression, it positioned itself as the champion of anti-imperialism. Soviet engineers helped build the Aswan Dam. Soviet arms filled Egyptian arsenals. Yet the Kremlin's motives were not idealistic. They were strategic. Moscow sought footholds in every region where Western pride had faltered. The Cold War had found its next arena. And so, From the sands of Sinai to the halls of the United Nations, the world began to divide, not along old colonial lines, but along ideological ones. The blue helmets that had once patrolled the canal would, in time, find themselves deployed to new crises, from Congo to Cyprus to Bosnia. The dream of peacekeeping had survived, but not without scars. In many ways, Suez had birthed the modern world order. A world where power had to justify itself, where alliances were fragile, and where the moral weight of nations mattered as much as their armies. The United Nations, once derided as toothless, had proven that diplomacy could tame even the ambitions of empires. Hammarskjöld's vision, quiet, disciplined, human, had prevailed, if only for a moment. But history, ever restless, does not allow stillness for long. Nasser's triumph would eventually give way to tragedy. In 1967, during the Six-Day War, Egypt would lose the Sinai Peninsula, the very land it had fought so fiercely to defend a decade earlier. The dreams of unity would fracture. The Arab world would once again find itself divided by politics, pride, and fear. Yet, even in defeat, the memory of Suez remained untouchable. It was the proof that defiance was possible, that the colonized could shape their own destiny, even if the journey was long and uncertain. For the world beyond the Middle East, the differented by the light of the Blue Canal's waters continued to flow, carrying oil, ships, and the quiet passage of time. Each vessel that crossed it traced the same route that once carried the hopes and heartbreaks of nations. Few thought of the men who had fought there, or the diplomats who had argued over it, or the people who had rebuilt its banks. Yet every crossing was a reminder that history, like the Suez itself, is never still. It moves endlessly, shaped by the currents beneath. And so, the legacy of Suez endures not as a monument or a battlefield, but as a mirror. It reflects the ambitions of those who sought to control it, and the courage of those who refused. It reminds the powerful that pride can blind, and the weak that resistance is not always futile. It tells us that wars are not only fought with weapons, but with ideas, and that sometimes the quietest victories echo the longest. In the end, the Suez Crisis was not about a canal at all. It was about the passage of time from empire to independence, from arrogance to humility, from domination to dialogue. It was the story of a world learning, painfully and beautifully, that control is an illusion, and that history always belongs to those who adapt. The canal still gleams under the Egyptian sun, as ships from every nation glide through its waters. The flags have changed, the empires have vanished, the world has moved on. Yet beneath its surface, if you listen closely, you can still hear the whisper of 1956, the sound of an age ending and another beginning. The Suez Crisis did not destroy the world. It revealed it fragile, flawed, interdependent, and endlessly human. And perhaps that is the truest legacy of all. Chapter 16. The World After Suez. The canal lies quiet again. Ships glide through its waters with slow, measured grace. Oil tankers, cargo vessels, passenger liners from every corner of the world. The desert sun glimmers off their steel hulls, and the air hums softly with the low thrum of engines. On the surface, everything seems calm. Yet beneath those waters runs the ghost of history, the invisible current of 1956, still shaping the world that followed. The Suez Crisis was over, but its aftershocks never truly faded. The conflict had lasted just over a week, yet its consequences stretched across decades into new wars, new alliances, and new ways of thinking about power itself. It marked the end of an old world, and the beginning of one still uncertain, still learning what freedom, sovereignty, and unity really meant. In the years that followed, the Middle East transformed. Egypt stood taller, though scarred. The name Nasser echoed from the Mediterranean to the Red Sea, a symbol of defiance, pride, and identity. Under his leadership, Egypt became the beating heart of the Arab world, its capital a crossroads of revolution and diplomacy. Cairo's streets buzzed with students, activists, and journalists. The radio waves carried messages of independence to lands still bound by colonial chains. But the same winds that lifted Egypt also carried storm clouds. The West, unwilling to lose its influence, found new ways to shape the region. Economic aid replaced occupation, arms replaced armies, and influence wore the mask of friendship. In that balance between independence and dependence, the Middle East became the mirror of the modern age, a place where ideals met reality, and where power was never as simple as victory or defeat. The Arab-Israeli conflict, which had flared during the Suez Crisis, continued to define regional politics. Israel, though militarily triumphant in 1956, had learned the limits of its power, that even success on the battlefield could be undone by international pressure. Its leaders took that lesson to heart, preparing for future wars with both caution and precision. And when war came again, in 1967, the shadows of Suez were still there in every calculation, every decision, every line drawn in the sand. For the Arab world, Suez became both a triumph and a burden. It proved that resistance was possible, that a single nation could stand against empire and survive. But it also ignited expectations that no one man or movement could sustain. Nasser's vision of Arab unity inspired millions, yet it also set in motion rivalries between nations that claimed to share his dream. Over time, the solidarity of 1956 gave way to division, suspicion, and the old ghosts of power reborn under new flags. Still, the idea of independence, of choosing one's own destiny, never died. From Africa to Asia, from the Caribbean to the Pacific, newly freed nations drew courage from Egypt's stand. Ghana, Nigeria, Kenya, Algeria, Malaysia, and dozens more all found their voices in the years that followed Suez. To them, the canal was not just a strip of water. It was a symbol of something far larger, the moment the world's balance tilted, and the periphery became the center. And for the West, the lesson of Suez was both painful and necessary. Britain and France learned that the age of direct rule was gone forever. Their flags came down in colonies across Africa and Asia, replaced by the flags of nations that had once been their subjects. The British Empire gave way to the Commonwealth, a partnership built on memory rather than mastery. France, wounded but proud, reinvented itself through de Gaulle's vision of grandeur without empire, seeking power through diplomacy, culture, and its own nuclear independence. For the United States, Suez was both victory and warning. Eisenhower's firm stand against his own allies had preserved America's global credibility, but it also bound the U.S. to a new responsibility. From then on, Washington would be the referee of crises it did not always understand, drawn again and again into conflicts born of colonial legacies it never lived through. The Cold War turned the world into a chessboard, but Suez reminded everyone that the pieces did not always move as planned. The Soviet Union, too, saw opportunity. By siding with Egypt, Moscow positioned itself as the defender of the oppressed, the friend of the newly independent. Soviet engineers built dams, trained pilots, and filled arsenals. Yet for all its rhetoric of liberation, the USSR's involvement carried its own ambitions. The world had traded empires of land for empires of influence, and the struggle for hearts and minds had only just begun. But amid the rivalry and realignment, something extraordinary had also begun to grow, a fragile, shimmering hope for cooperation. Out of the ashes of Suez came one of humanity's quiet triumphs, peacekeeping. The blue-helmeted soldiers who had first arrived in Egypt in 1956 became the living symbol of a new kind of courage, the courage not to fight. Their mission proved that the world could, even briefly, act together to prevent catastrophe. From Sinai to Lebanon, from Cambodia to Kosovo, their legacy continued imperfect but enduring. And there was another legacy too, less visible but more profound: humility. The Suez Crisis forced the great powers to look inward. It taught them that domination was not destiny, that moral authority mattered more than might, and that even centuries-old empires could lose everything in a single week of arrogance. In a way, Suez became the quiet teacher of the 20th century. Every time a superpower hesitated before invading a weaker nation, every time diplomats chose negotiation over escalation, every time the United Nations tried and sometimes failed to hold peace together, the ghost of Suez was there, whispering its warning. Power without purpose is a shadow that devours its own light. Even decades later, the echoes lingered. When Egyptian workers widened the canal in the 1,970 seconds, they unearthed relics of that brief war: rusted shells, sunken vehicles, fragments of uniforms half buried in sand. The artifacts were sent to museums, but the real memory lived in the people. In old Port Said, elders still told their grandchildren of the week. The sky rained fire, and of how the foreign ships left, and the blue helmets came. "We were afraid," one man said, "but when the last soldier sailed away, we knew we would never bow again." Today, the Suez Canal remains one of the busiest waterways in the world, a lifeline of trade, a bridge between continents. Its waters no longer carry the ambitions of empires, but the commerce of a shared world. Cargo ships glide through with quiet efficiency, their wakes erasing the footprints of history. And yet, every crossing is part of that story, the story of 1956, of a small country that stood tall, of empires that learned to let go, and of a world still learning what it means to be free. As the sun sets over the desert, the canal glows like a ribbon of light. Somewhere nearby, the call to prayer drifts across the water, mingling with the hum of engines and the whisper of wind. It is the sound of continuity of life that moves on, even after the grandest dreams have faded. History does not end with victories or defeats. It ends with understanding. And in that sense, Suez was never just a crisis. It was a mirror showing humanity its own reflection, proud and flawed, capable of destruction yet yearning for peace. For the empires, Suez was the final lullaby. For Egypt, it was the dawn of a new song. And for the world, it was a reminder that every age of power must eventually learn to sleep. Chapter 17. Echoes Through Time. History never truly sleeps. It whispers, sometimes softly, sometimes in the voice of a storm, sometimes in the faint hum of a ship's engine passing through waters that once ran red with fire. The Suez Canal, carved through the desert by men who believed they could reshape the earth itself, has seen empires rise and fall, leaders come and go, and dreams turn to dust. And yet, even now, the same winds that swept across the battlefield in 1956 still carry the faintest echo of ambition, of defiance, of change. The story of the Suez Crisis did not end when the last shot was fired or when the blue helmets arrived to keep the peace. It continued not as war, but as memory. For Egypt, the memory became strength. For Britain and France, it became a lesson. For the world, it became a quiet mirror, reflecting both the beauty and the tragedy of what it means to be human. In Cairo, the generations that followed grew up under the shadow of Nasser's image, the strong, calm face that had stared down the West. In classrooms, children learned of the day Egypt reclaimed the canal, not as a tale of victory, but as a testament to dignity. In the songs sung along the Nile at night, his name still lingered not as a man, but as an idea. To stand, to resist, to belong. But even ideas change. By the 1,970 seconds, a new Egypt was emerging, one that spoke not in the language of defiance, but of pragmatism. Under Anwar Sadat, the canal that had once symbolized rebellion became a bridge again between East and West, between war and peace. When Sadat reopened the canal in 1975, allowing ships to pass freely once more, he stood at its edge and said, "The canal has seen too much blood. Let it carry life again." His words drifted like prayer over the still waters. And for a while, it did. In London, The lessons of Suez shaped an entire generation of leaders. The British learned that greatness could no longer be measured in colonies, but in cooperation. The empire had vanished, but in its place grew something quieter, perhaps wiser, a nation defined not by the territories it ruled, but by the ideals it carried. Suez taught us humility, one diplomat later said. It reminded us that influence is not inherited, it is earned. In Paris, the ghost of Suez gave birth to independence of a different kind. Charles de Gaulle, who rose to power 2 years after the crisis, turned France's humiliation into resolve. No longer would French policy be dictated by others. He withdrew from NATO's military command, built an independent nuclear program, and redrew France's place in the world, proud, separate, and sovereign. Suez had stripped away illusion, but from the wreckage, de Gaulle built identity. The world after Suez was not simpler, only wiser. It became a world of subtler empires, of economics, technology, and culture. Armies no longer marched across deserts for glory, but trade routes still mattered, resources still bound nations together, and pride still whispered in the halls of power. Yet, the old pattern, the dance between dominance and defiance, continued. The lessons of Suez repeated themselves in new forms. In Vietnam, where America discovered that military strength cannot command belief. In Afghanistan, where superpowers learned that occupation breeds resistance. In Iraq, where ambition once again met the limits of understanding. Each time, the world seemed to forget, only to remember again that the struggle for control always ends the same way, in exhaustion. The canal remained. Its waters reflected not the flags of empires, but the faces of sailors, traders, and travelers. People who carried no armies, only the commerce of an interconnected planet. But beneath that calm surface, the old ghosts lingered. In 1967, when war returned between Israel and Egypt, the canal was closed again, filled with wreckage and mines. For 8 years, it sat frozen, a wound cutting through the desert. It would take years of diplomacy and another war before the waterway reopened. And when it did, the ships sailed as they always had, silent, steady, as if nothing had changed. But everything had. The world they crossed now was one of independence, not empire, of nations, not colonies, of negotiations, not dictates. Even the United Nations, born from the chaos of World War, was reborn through Suez. The peacekeeping model that began in those tense November nights of 1956 became the framework for global response. It was imperfect, painfully so, yet it represented something sacred, the belief that humanity could, at least sometimes, protect itself from its worst instincts. The blue helmets that had once patrolled the sands of Sinai would one day stand in Lebanon, Bosnia, Rwanda, and beyond each mission, an echo of that first fragile hope. And still, the world kept turning. The Cold War came and went. Nasser's Egypt became Sadat's Egypt, then Mubarak's Egypt, then another Egypt, still changing faces, but never forgetting where it began. The Suez Canal expanded, deepened, modernized. New superpowers rose in Asia, old alliances fractured, and global trade bound the world closer than ever. Yet, every few years, when a ship lodged itself across the canal or tensions flared in the region, headlines would resurface: Suez, blockage, crisis. The word itself had become timeless shorthand for global fragility. But the true legacy of Suez lies not in politics or geography, but in perspective. It was the moment the world realized that no nation, however powerful, could shape history alone. It showed that pride without foresight is as dangerous as fear without courage. It proved that even the smallest act, one leader's decision to seize a canal, could reshape the destinies of continents. History is a patient teacher, but it speaks softly. Those who listen hear the same refrain, repeated across centuries, that domination breeds resistance, and that every empire, no matter how mighty, must one day bow to the tide. When the wind blows across the canal today, it carries no flags, no anthems, only the scent of salt, the murmur of machinery, and the faint hum of the present, blending with the past. Somewhere in that sound lies the heartbeat of what Suez left behind. A world both humbled and connected, fractured yet interwoven, forever reminded that control is never permanent, but coexistence can be. The ships keep moving. The sand keeps shifting. The voices fade, but the echo remains. Chapter 18, The Canal of Memory. At dawn, the desert glows gold. The air is still. The Suez Canal lies before it calm, silver, and endless, stretching from the Mediterranean to the Red Sea like a scar and a promise. Along its banks, cranes rise where forts once stood. The wind carries no battle cries now, only the soft clang of ships docking, the distant murmur of engines, the faint call of a muezzin carried over the sand. To stand at its edge today is to stand inside history itself. Every ripple of the canal carries a memory, the sweat of the men who dug it, the pride of the empires that claimed it, the fury of the bombs that fell over it, and the long silence that followed. It is a waterway, yes, but it is also a mirror in which humanity can still see its reflection, proud, flawed, restless, always reaching for something just beyond its grasp. More than a century ago, when the canal first opened, crowds gathered from every corner of the world to witness what they believed was the triumph of civilization over nature. Here, in the desert, mankind had carved a passage between seas, a shortcut between worlds. They believed it would bring unity, progress, prosperity, and for a time, it did. But progress has a habit of casting shadows. The canal that connected continents also divided them. It became a symbol of control of who commanded the flow of trade, of who decided whose ships could pass. It was the artery of empire, and empire, like every living thing, has a heart that cannot beat forever. By 1956, the illusion of control had finally broken. When Nasser stood before the people and declared the canal Egypt's own, the world gasped. In that single act, the old order cracked open. The empires that had once ruled from London and Paris found themselves staring into the same mirror that had once reflected their power, now reflecting their age. The war that Paris secondary followed lasted only days, but its meaning stretched beyond lifetimes. The Suez Crisis was the story of endings disguised as battles. For Egypt, it was the end of submission. For Britain and France, it was the end of illusion. And for the world, it was the end of an era, the final breath of the colonial century. Out of its dust rose new voices, new nations, and a new kind of power. Not the power to rule, but the power to resist. And yet, what endures from that moment is not anger, but awakening. Suez became the crossroads, where arrogance met humility, where violence met reason, where history turned quietly, almost gently, toward its next chapter. The canal itself seems to remember. Every dawn, the sunlight glides across its surface, like the turning of a page. The waters still shimmer, where paratroopers once fell. The banks where tanks once burned are now lined with docks, markets, and cranes. And still, the current moves, carrying ships from one sea to another, carrying too, the unspoken story of how the world changed here, not with victory, but with understanding. In the decades that followed, Egypt rebuilt, the world evolved, and the Suez Canal became not a line of division, but of connection once more. When the canal reopened in 1975 after years of war, ships of every flag returned, as if retracing the route of history itself. The first vessel to pass through was a Soviet cargo ship, the second an American. Behind them came vessels from Europe, Asia, Africa, a procession of nations that had once been enemies, now bound by commerce more than conquest. As it always has, the canal turned conflict into continuity. The same waters that once reflected flames now reflect the stars. But if you listen carefully, if you close your eyes to the sound of diesel engines and cranes, you can still hear the echoes. The boots of British soldiers on sand, the roar of French jets over Port Said, the crackle of Nasser's voice on Cairo radio, defiant and steady. The canal is ours. And beneath it all, the sigh of the world, weary, awakening, letting go. History, after all, does not vanish. It lingers in the air, in the soil, in the memory of those who inherit its silence. The canal remembers everything. The dreams of empire, the defiance of the colonized, the arrival of the blue helmets, the quiet handshake that followed. It remembers the moment humanity realized that it could no longer divide the earth by pride, that the tide was stronger than any flag. Even now, as ships pass through, their wakes ripple outward faint waves that travel farther than sight. Somewhere, far beyond, they reach other shores, carrying with them the lesson of Suez, that power is fleeting, but connection endures. To stand here at dusk is to see the whole story. In one breath, the fading sun painting the water in amber and rose, the silhouettes of cranes against the horizon, the slow rhythm of ships gliding through. You can almost feel the weight of time itself, flowing past you, indifferent and eternal. Once, this canal was carved to shorten journeys, but in doing so, it lengthened history, binding together lands, ideas, and destinies that had long drifted apart. It became a symbol not of separation, but of inevitability. The inevitability that all things, whether empires or dreams, must one day meet the current of change. And yet, there is something tender in that inevitability. Just as the sea reclaims every shore, time reclaims every crown, every fortress, every illusion of permanence. What remains are the stories we tell, the lessons we pass, the hope that even after the fiercest storms, the world can find stillness again. The Suez Canal is that stillness, the calm after centuries of motion. Its waters have seen ships of conquest and ships of mercy, war fleets and merchant vessels, and through it all, they have flowed in one direction, forward. The empires have slept, the flags have changed. The voices that once thundered across continents have become faint as wind. But the canal remains carrying not domination, but remembrance. And perhaps that is what history truly is. Not the battles, but the memory of how we learned to move beyond them. In the hush of the desert night, when the stars reflect perfectly in the canal's surface, it is easy to imagine that time itself is pausing to look back, to marvel, to mourn, to forgive. The water glows softly, like a ribbon of memory stretching through centuries, whispering a lullaby to everything that once was. This, then, is the story of Suez, not of power, but of passage. The passage of ships, the passage of time, the passage from arrogance to understanding, from empire to empathy. And as the night deepens and the canal disappears into shadow, one truth remains as gentle and unending as its flow. That history, like water, always finds its way home. The world turns quietly now. The night settles over the desert like a soft blanket, and the Suez Canal gleams faintly under the moonlight, a silver thread connecting two seas, two worlds, and two centuries. Somewhere in the distance, the hum of a passing ship echoes through the still air, low, steady, ancient, like the heartbeat of history itself. The water that flows through Suez tonight is the same that carried the dreams of empire, the same that bore the weight of ambition and the cries of freedom. It has seen soldiers march, kings fall, and nations awaken. It has reflected the faces of men who believed they could command the tide and then watched, in silence, as the tide commanded them. If you close your eyes, you can almost see them. The silhouettes of British warships cutting through the mist, French paratroopers landing on the sand, Israeli tanks rumbling through the Sinai night, and Egyptian villagers standing at their doorways, listening to the thunder from afar. You can hear Nasser's voice on the radio, steady and defiant. The canal is ours. And, somewhere, far away, in the offices of London and Paris, you can hear the quiet crumble of certainty. The world of 1956 was not yet modern, but it was already changing. The old empires that once ruled the globe were beginning to fade, their maps dissolving under the light of a new dawn. Nations long silenced were finding their voices. The Suez Crisis was not just a war over a canal, it was the sound of history shifting beneath its own weight. Britain and France learned that empires, like men, cannot live forever. They learned that control has a cost, and pride has an ending. For them, Suez was the mirror they could not look away from, a reflection of everything they once were, and everything they could never be again. From its ashes, they found humility. From humility, a new kind of strength. Egypt learned something else, that survival is sometimes the greatest victory of all. Against the weight of three nations, it stood firm, and in doing so, it gave the world a new vocabulary: independence, dignity, and defiance. Nasser became more than a leader. He became the embodiment of a dream that stretched across deserts and decades, a dream of a people no longer ruled, no longer voiceless. And for the world beyond, Suez whispered a truth that would echo through every conflict that followed. That power cannot be measured in guns or ships, but in the ability to inspire or to endure. The United Nations, born from the ashes of the Second World War, took its first trembling steps here, learning that peace could not be imposed by victors, but protected by guardians. The blue helmets who stood between armies on Egyptian soil were not warriors. They were witnesses to humanity's first attempt to live beyond conquest. For a moment, it worked. The guns went quiet. The canal flowed freely. And the world, bruised but wiser, moved on. Time carried it forward, as it always does. The soldiers of Suez grew old. The leaders who once commanded millions became faces in books. The empires they built turned into footnotes. And yet, the canal remains still open, still busy, still quietly watching. Every ship that passes through it carries more than cargo. It carries memory. Memory of the world that was. Memory of the mistakes we made. Memory of the lessons we learned too late. History has no villains and no saints, only choices and their consequences. The men who fought for Suez believed they were protecting their nations. The men who resisted believed they were protecting their dignity. All of them, in their own way, were right. And all of them, in their own way, were wrong. That is what makes history human and beautiful. It is not the certainty of its heroes, but the frailty of their hope. If there is one truth that the Suez Canal teaches us, it is that time is the greatest current of all. It carries everything forward, the proud and the humble, the conquerors and the conquered. It erases names from stones, yet it preserves their echoes in water. Tonight, those echoes are gentle. The world sleeps, but history breathes in the steady rhythm of waves against the shore, in the hum of engines crossing from sea to sea, in the sigh of wind through the dunes. Somewhere, an old man in Cairo tells his grandson of the days when the world changed, when Egypt stood alone and the great empires bent beneath their own weight. The boy listens, eyes wide, imagining ships of steel and skies of fire, but also the silence that followed, the kind of silence that feels like peace. Somewhere, a British historian runs his fingers across the edges of a faded map, tracing the red lines of empire that once stretched around the world. He does not feel pride or regret, only wonder. How strange it is, he thinks, that we once believed the earth could belong to anyone, and somewhere, far out at sea, a sailor steering his vessel through the canal looks at the stars reflected on the water and realizes he is gliding over history, a history written not in ink but in courage, in arrogance, in hope. The Suez Canal, once the artery of empire, is now the vein of humanity carrying the lifeblood of our shared world, connecting continents not through conquest, but through commerce, through necessity, through peace. The war that once raged here feels like a distant dream, now a shadow swallowed by time. Yet its meaning endures. For Suez was not the story of victory or defeat, but of awakening. It was the moment the world learned that the future does not belong to those who cling to power, but to those who dare to let it go. As the night deepens and the ships continue their slow passage, The canal glows faintly under the stars, eternal, patient, and wise. It has seen enough to know that history always returns, that pride always yields to time, and that peace, though fragile, is the most powerful current of all. The camera drifts upward now past the silver surface of the water, past the lights of the ships, past the dunes and the horizon, into the vast, quiet sky. The world below fades into shadow, but the line of the canal still glimmers faintly, a thread of memory, a reminder of all that was and all that remains. And as the music softens, the voice returns one last whisper to those still awake. Empires rise, empires fall, but the river of time flows on, and in its reflection, we find ourselves again and again. Good night.